Hey guys, tonight we step into the quiet, creaky world of lacquered steel, woven silk cords, and the soft, rhythmic brushing of soot from iron. You're not wielding a katana. You're not meditating under a waterfall. You're not even training in the art of war. No, you've taken on something far more dangerous to your patience. This evening, you are a samurai armor maker. And it's a sleepy, sticky morning in a small village on the edge of nothing in particular, where the only battles are fought against fraying thread, late payments, and the occasional beetle that decides to die in your rice bin. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Because somewhere out there, someone is definitely polishing a suit of armor at 3 a.m., just like you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with the door. Not a dramatic sliding temple door or a fortress gate guarded by grim-faced retainers, but a low, slightly warped wooden panel with a bamboo curtain that always gets tangled on your shoulder, no matter how slowly you move. The hinges creak in a polite, resigned sort of way, as though apologizing for their lack of oil, but still too proud to fall off entirely. And when you step outside, the courtyard is damp with early dew, the kind that coats your sandals and makes the stone feel like chilled tofu underfoot. You sweep, of course, every morning. Not because anyone important is coming, but because if you don't, the wind deposits tiny drifts of powdered charcoal and dried husks from yesterday's rice sacks into the corners of the workshop, until the place smells like a burnt onigiri, forgotten on a brazier. You take your time, dragging the straw broom in wide, deliberate arcs, and try not to think about how the apprentice was supposed to do this before he disappeared last week, again, claiming family matters, but probably just following a traveling noodle cart halfway across the province. The forge isn't lit yet, and that's intentional. There's no rush. The helmets that need riveting won't warp if they wait another hour. And the shoulder guards haven't threatened to assemble themselves in protest. No one in the village seems particularly anxious to march off to war today. And even the local magistrate, who once ordered a half-armor set just to impress a tea mistress, hasn't shown up since the cherry blossoms bloomed, probably still nursing a splinter in his ego after she ran off with a fan maker instead. Inside the workshop, the air smells of old cedar, oilcloth, singed fabric, and that peculiar sharpness that only exists where metal meets sweat. The tools rest exactly where you left them yesterday. A bone-handled awl balanced precariously on the edge of a polishing stone. A row of curved chisels lined up like monks in meditation. And your grandfather's tongs, blunt, heavy, and slightly crooked from the time he tried to bend a horse bit, with nothing but elbow grease and optimism. You reach for the charcoal bin and find, as always, that the best pieces have migrated to the bottom, like how the tastiest pickles always hide under the brine. You fish them out with your fingertips, leaving streaks of gray along your nails, and carry them back to the forge, one small basket at a time, pausing every few steps to avoid tripping over the cat, who has decided that today, the exact center of your walking path is the only acceptable place to nap. Lighting the forge is an art form in itself. You squat beside it, balancing on your heels, and coax the flame into life with thin sticks dipped in lamp oil, and the quiet insistence of someone who has done this thousands of times. The fire crackles once, twice, then settles into a lazy murmur, licking the sides of the old brazier like it's waking up from its own nap. You add the first few chunks of charcoal, then a few more, and sit back to watch the smoke curl upward through the vent in the roof, drawing soft silhouettes on the rafters that look suspiciously like oni faces if you stare too long. This is where your day truly begins, not with explosions or ceremonial drum beats, but with a gentle hum of warmth, the creak of leather against your knees, and the steady rhythm of air bellows as you begin preparing the workbench for another round of armor that nobody seems to need urgently, yet everyone claims is essential. Today's task, you've decided, is the kusazuri, the skirt-like tassets that hang from the cuirass to protect the hips and thighs, made from overlapping plates lacquered to a mirror finish and laced together with silk cords, so stubborn they might as well be alive. You unwrap the bundle of pre-cut plates, each shaped like a miniature tongue, each slightly warped in its own special way, and line them up like offerings on the bench, their lacquer gleaming like spilled ink under the rising light. You pick up the first one, run your finger along the edge, pause, and realize that, once again, someone has forgotten to file down the burrs from the casting. You sigh, not in frustration, but in the long-suffering way of someone who knows they'll spend the next hour shaving down rough spots with a file so fine it sings like a mosquito when it hits the right rhythm. You hum along without realizing it, tapping your foot to no melody in particular, and begin. This part is always meditative. The metal sings, the forge breathes, the cat snores, and outside, the sound of a distant bamboo water spout echoes, clack, 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 as if the entire village is slowly ticking forward by increments of nothing much at all. You lose track of time, and that's all right. No courier has come demanding updates. No warlord has sent a scroll sealed with urgency. Your client, the one who requested this particular set of armor 6 months ago, hasn't written in weeks, and may very well have been reassigned to stand guard over a bridge that no one uses anymore. Still, you continue, because that's the way of it. Not for honor, not for fame, but because the motion itself is enough. Because when your hands are moving, the world grows quieter, and somewhere in the rhythm of thread and steel and breath, you find the closest thing to peace that exists this side of battle. A mosquito lands on your wrist. You let it. It bites. You don't flinch. It's part of the ritual now. Eventually, you lean back, roll your shoulders, and set down the file. You stretch your arms toward the ceiling, bones cracking like old floorboards, and glance toward the window. The sun is higher now. Not high, mind you, just slightly less horizontal. The kind of brightness that says, yes, this day might do something interesting, but probably not until after lunch, which is fine by you, because armor doesn't rush, and neither do you. The light in the workshop shifts almost imperceptibly, soft gold leaking through the slats in the shutters, not quite strong enough to warm your shoulders, but enough to highlight the fine floating particles of dust and ash that swirl in the air, suspended like tiny lazy ghosts with nowhere better to be. And you exhale slowly as you set aside the finished kusazuri plate, its lacquer gleaming more out of habit than pride. Because while perfection is never guaranteed, the illusion of it, when caught in just the right light, has a way of making even a flawed morning feel like it belonged on a scroll painting. You reach for the next plate, but pause halfway, your fingers resting briefly on the rim of your small, cracked teacup, the one with the chip shaped like a rabbit ear and the faint stain that never quite washes out, and take a sip of what's left. Cold barley tea, mostly water now, with that strange aftertaste of burnt straw that you've come to accept as one of life's small, unfixable quirks, much like your recurring dream, where you mislace the cuirass and a ghost, samurai, refuses to leave until you redo it 3 times in a row. The breastplate waits, not in an ominous or threatening way, but in the same quiet, slightly accusatory manner as someone standing silently in the corner, arms crossed, wondering when you're finally going to give them the attention they're owed. And you sigh once more, not out of boredom, but out of the deep, bone-level acknowledgement that the breastplate will require more patience than you probably have this early in the day. Still, you lift it. It's heavier than it looks. A composite of iron and hardened leather, lacquered in black, with faint red underlays. And despite its age, it's still handsome in that rugged, slightly dented way some old warriors are. Scarred but steady, elegant without ever trying. And as you run your palm over its curved surface, you feel the familiar unevenness beneath the lacquer, small warps where blades may have glanced off, places where history lives quietly under layers of polish. Your polishing cloth is already dark with last week's residue, but you use it anyway, applying the usual mixture of oil, crushed shell powder, and a little spit. Yes, it's unglamorous, but honestly, you've tried the expensive imported stuff, and it never worked half as well as the combination of muscle memory and low expectations. The motion is simple. Long, circular swipes that trace the curve of the die like you're painting invisible spirals across time itself. And soon your shoulders find their rhythm, your hands gliding over the surface again and again, and your mind slips into that odd trance where thought drifts just below awareness, a gentle hum of disconnected ideas. The cat's missing again. The lantern wick needs trimming. You never did fix the leak in the awning. And is that a new creak in the floorboards or just your knees? 30 minutes pass. Maybe more. You don't measure time anymore, not in minutes or hours, but in layers of shine, in the way the lacquer gradually awakens under your touch, from dull gray sheen to that subtle mirror-like depth that captures just a hint of your face. Blurry, distorted, but unmistakably you. The armor maker, the polisher, the almost samurai of slowness, bent over yet another breastplate, destined for someone who will probably never remember your name. You stop for a moment to stretch. Your back complains with a series of clicks, like a wooden signboard in the wind. And you glance outside through the slightly open panel. Beyond the porch, the street is empty, except for a straw-hatted vendor walking slowly with a cart of daikon, each root bouncing gently, as if also resigned to their afternoon fate. And in the distance, you think you hear the soft thrum of a koto string being plucked. Or maybe it's just the wind whistling through the eaves again. Back inside, the cloth moves again. More slowly now. You've reached the edges, those tricky parts where dust gathers like gossip. And it takes a finer hand, small emotions, and an unreasonable amount of patience to coax the dirt from the rivet grooves without scratching the lacquer or cursing aloud. A rule you imposed after the neighbor's child once wandered in, copied your grumbling perfectly, and repeated it loudly during a temple ceremony, much to everyone's horror. The breastplate, as you work, begins to feel alive. Not sentient, not magical, just lived in. Like an old pair of sandals that remember every stone they ever stepped on. And you find yourself wondering, not for the first time, where this particular piece has traveled. There's no name inscribed, no clan crest etched into its surface. Just a faint mark near the top, shaped like a plum blossom, perhaps a craftsman's signature, perhaps just an accidental stain from years ago. But it stirs a memory you can't quite place. Something about a traveling merchant who once claimed to own a whole collection of ghost armor, each piece stolen from warriors who died standing up, never falling, their bones still rattling inside the plates whenever the wind changed direction. Historians still argue whether such stories were mere battlefield gossip or subtle metaphors for the stubbornness of soldiers too proud to die properly. But either way, you've never seen a ghost inside this armor. Only your own reflection, slightly warped, and the growing shine beneath your cloth, like a quiet reward for effort unspoken. Eventually, as the light shifts again, you sit back. The breastplate gleams, not like new, never like new, but with that deep, respectful shine that speaks of age and maintenance and a quiet kind of dignity. And you place it gently onto the wooden rack near the wall, just above the row of armored sleeves you've been pretending not to notice for the past 3 weeks. You're not done for the day. Not by a long shot. But this moment, this small triumph of shine over soot, is worth savoring. So naturally, you do what anyone in your position would do. You pour a tiny cup of lukewarm tea, nibble a pickled plum that puckers your entire face into a temporary mask of regret, and then reach for the next piece, another dowel, slightly larger, slightly dented, slightly more annoying, but it's part of the rhythm. Each polish, each piece, each tiny motion, repeated thousands of times until your hands know the curves better than your own face. Until the metal whispers back under your cloth, until the hours melt and the daylight dims, and the birds outside begin to argue with frogs about whose song is more important. You sigh, you smile, and you keep polishing, because this is the life of a samurai armor maker. Not dramatic, not bloody, not filled with shouts of honor and revenge, but steady, quiet, slightly dusty, and endlessly repetitive. And somehow, in all that monotony, there's a strange kind of peace. There's something oddly ceremonial about threading silk cords through punched holes in overlapping iron plates, a kind of sacred ritual that exists somewhere between embroidery and metallurgy, demanding a level of patience that most sword fighters would scoff at, yet one that you've come to regard as a test of the soul. Because if anything reveals your true nature, it's how you react to a knot that forms one loop too early and refuses to come undone, without pulling the entire line back through 14 tiny eyelets, with the delicacy of a spider. building its web in a windstorm. Today's lacing work involves the sword, the large rectangular shoulder guards that flare out like wings, intended to protect samurai from sideways slashes and the occasional ambitious arrow. Though honestly, you've always suspected that half the reason they were designed so broadly was to give commanders a more dramatic silhouette during battle formations, especially when viewed from a flattering three-quarter angle during sunset marches. The pieces are already lacquered, a deep matte black with reddish undertones that shift subtly depending on how the sunlight hits them through the slats in the wall. And they're lined up before you like an expectant audience, each with pre-drilled holes spaced in perfect intervals, mocking you silently with the sheer amount of threading they demand, each needing over 2 meters of silk cord, looped and pulled and tied and tightened, again and again, without fraying the edges or skipping a hole or, heaven forbid, accidentally pulling too tight and causing a wrinkle in the pattern. You pick up the first cord, a deep indigo, hand-dyed, and still carrying a faint scent of fermented plum bark from the dyeing process, and test it between your fingers, rolling it gently, checking for inconsistencies in tension, knowing full well that if even a single stretch feels thinner, it'll snap at the worst possible moment. Probably when your client is demonstrating his new armor to an impressed aunt or skeptical foot soldier. With a long exhale, you thread the first hole, then the second, then the third. The rhythm takes hold, steady and quiet. The sound of silk sliding through lacquered holes, like whispering reeds by a pond, punctuated only by the occasional tug, the tightening of slack, and your soft grunt of disapproval when the cord stubbornly kinks in a way that defies all logic and physics, as if possessed by the spirit of a disgruntled textile ghost who never forgave being unraveled during the Edo period. Halfway through the panel, your stomach growls, a long, low, declarative rumble that seems to vibrate against the workbench, and you pause to consider whether you should stand and fetch the rice ball you wrapped in lotus leaf earlier, or simply ignore the sensation in the hopes that it goes away like a child told to nap. But of course you get up. The rice ball is precisely where you left it, tucked in a corner of your small kitchen shelf under a pottery lid, meant more for symbolism than practicality. And when you unwrap the leaf, the steam has long since fled, leaving behind a slightly stiff, slightly too salty triangle of seaweed and grain, comfortingly underwhelming in the way only yesterday's lunch can be. You chew slowly, gazing out through the crooked window panel where 2 sparrows are currently arguing over territory near the rain barrel, their chirps sharp and shrill and completely unbothered by your presence. Back at the workbench, you resume your threading. There's something satisfying about the repetition, even when it borders on maddening, a kind of meditative punishment that rewards consistency over creativity. Because nobody cares how inspired your lacing looks if it comes undone in the middle of a duel, flapping wildly like a broken fan, embarrassing the poor warrior and sending him spiraling into existential doubt about his tailor's loyalty. Historians still argue whether the complexity of samurai armor lacing evolved purely for aesthetic grandeur, or whether it had tactical advantages in battlefield identification and impact dispersion. But either way, it's universally agreed that whoever first invented the triple back loop with alternating crossover pattern, was clearly both a genius and a sadist. Perhaps both in equal measure. As you move to the next panel, your fingers start to cramp slightly, the tendons in your knuckles tightening in protest, your wrists aching from the repeated twist-pull-tighten motions. But you push through, because there's a kind of stubborn joy in refusing to pause, in proving that you can finish an entire sword without once having to cut the cord or realign the top row. And you murmur to yourself softly, a running commentary of complaints and encouragement, the kind of monologue only craftsmen and insomniacs truly understand. Somewhere outside, a bamboo wind chime stirs faintly, releasing a single hollow note that resonates through the stillness like a dropped pebble in an empty well. The sunlight has shifted again, its golden slant beginning to fade toward amber, signaling the start of late afternoon, the time of day when shadows grow long and thoughtful, and even the most determined beetles retreat beneath the porch in search of cooler wood. You finally finish one full shoulder guard. It rests on the bench, complete, cords taut and gleaming, symmetry nearly perfect, save for one tiny stitch that's just slightly too tight on the bottom left corner, which no one but you will ever notice, and which, by tomorrow, you'll either fix or convince yourself is a symbolic homage to the imperfection of all things. You roll your wrists, flex your fingers, and stand slowly. Your knees crack, your back protests, but you smile anyway, because it's done. And there's something delightful in knowing that despite the slowness, the monotony, the sore joints, and the inevitable tea stains, you've created something that might outlast you, might end up in the hands of a soldier or a collector, or maybe just gather dust in a storehouse for 100 years, until someone decides it deserves a second life as a museum piece, complete with a misread plaque crediting it to an unknown master from the mid-Edo era. You imagine briefly that future, a quiet room in a quiet museum, visitors shuffling past, children tapping the glass, someone pointing at your lacing work and murmuring, "Look how neat that is," without ever knowing how many afternoons you spent talking to your tools and threatening the silk thread with poetic curses. You shake the image from your mind with a chuckle, take a sip of now room temperature tea, and glance toward the remaining sewed panel, still waiting to be laced. It doesn't complain, but it stares. You pick up the next cord and begin again, because the day isn't over. Not yet. And the armor, as always, is patient. The fire in the forge isn't blazing today, nor is it fully out. It rests somewhere in between, in that warm orange hush that lingers like the sigh of an old man who's just settled into a tatami mat after a long walk uphill. The kind of fire that doesn't demand your attention with roaring flames or smoke-filled theatrics, but instead hums along quietly, steady and low, just hot enough to keep the metal pliable if you decide to work, but calm enough to allow you to sit and simply exist next to it for a while, without feeling guilty for wasting good charcoal on an afternoon that already seems halfway gone. You sit on the wooden stool that wobbles slightly under your weight, a flaw you've promised yourself you'd fix for the past. 3 years now? But which, at this point, has become part of the charm. An old companion whose creak is as familiar as the clack of your tools. or the sound of rain on the roof tiles in midsummer. And you hold a slender strip of iron between your fingers, freshly cut, its surface still mottled from the hammering earlier, its edges cool, but not yet cold, like the back of a coin left out in the sun. Today's task, if you choose to accept it, and you always do, despite your dramatic groans, is to begin shaping the small components for the kabuto, the helmet, that majestic, absurd, over-engineered crown of the samurai ensemble that, depending on the era and the wearer's sense of drama, might include decorative horns, angry visages, bronze mustaches, or even rabbit ears, which, yes, did happen, though historians still argue whether the bunny-themed armor was meant to intimidate enemies with absurdity, or simply amuse allies during rainy campaigns. You grab your favorite hammer, not the big one used for breastplates, or the tiny peening one reserved for rivets, but the medium weight, perfectly balanced, slightly off-center hammer that's worn down on one side from years of use and feels more like an extension of your hand than a separate object. And you gently begin to flatten the edges of the strip, tapping softly, rotating, tapping again, rotating once more, until the flat begins to curve ever so slightly, like the edge of a crescent moon emerging from behind a cloud. The forge offers a quiet rhythm beneath your work, a low hiss and pop as the embers shift, and you work in sync with its breath. Strike, rotate, tap, pause, inhale, strike again, until the piece begins to resemble what you see in your mind. Not yet the finished crescent plate that will curve around the base of the helmet bowl, but its earliest shadow, the idea before it becomes form, the whisper before the word. Your sleeves are rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms dusted with iron flecks and lacquer stains. And as the afternoon sun slants through the open shoji panel, you can feel its warmth on your neck and the fine trickle of sweat sliding down between your shoulder blades, soaking into the linen, making everything just slightly more uncomfortable in that uniquely Japanese summer kind of way, where the air feels like warm tofu, and every breath makes you consider whether or not it's worth opening another window. But you don't move. You keep tapping, because the helmet isn't going to build itself. And besides, there's a strange kind of companionship that forms between you and your materials, especially during the heat-heavy lull of afternoon, when the world outside seems suspended in amber, and even the crickets are too lazy to chirp. Something about the silent agreement between your hands and the metal, the understanding that both of you are trying, both of you are flawed, but neither is giving up just yet. As the piece takes shape, you think back to a story an old master once told you about a kabuto that was forged so perfectly that the daimyo who wore it refused to remove it for weeks, claiming it granted him divine clarity during battles and dreams alike. Until, inevitably, he fell asleep one night with it still on and was found the next morning with an imprint of the rivets etched permanently into his forehead, which apparently didn't bother him at all. If anything, he called it his seal of wisdom and wore it with pride until the day he tripped over his own katana scabbard and had to be carried back to the castle by 3 embarrassed footmen and a rice farmer with a mule. You don't know if that story's true, but it makes you smile. And the metal, warmed by your palm and shaped by your hammer, seems to respond with a kind of quiet agreement, a subtle curve forming just right, a fitting snugness achieved without fuss. You set the crescent plate down carefully on the tray of shaped components, next to a piece you made last week that's just slightly crooked, which you haven't had the heart to melt down yet, and reach for the next strip. They're all slightly different. No matter how precisely you cut them, no matter how many measuring strings you stretch and re-stretch across the patterns. Because iron, like people, has a way of asserting its own opinion when you least expect it. Warping or resisting, or suddenly deciding to crack in protest like a bad poem read aloud to a critical audience of monks. You reheat the new strip in the forge, the color shifting from soot gray to a ruddy orange, then to bright yellow, just as you lift it with your tongs and lay it onto the small anvil, the one etched with 100 tiny scratches that map the history of your craft like a secret language. The tapping resumes, sparks rise briefly, and in that moment, you think about how the kabuto isn't just armor, it's identity, flair, philosophy, status symbol, psychological weapon, and in many ways, an artist's statement all at once. There's a reason that some samurai requested their helmets be adorned with sunbursts, or waves, or strange creatures with bulging eyes and open mouths, and it wasn't just vanity. It was performance, projection, the turning of battle into theater, and theater into immortality. You wonder if the helmet you're making now will end up with horns or wings or something ridiculous like a turnip. Yes, that happened too. Look it up. The embers sigh. Your hammer slows. The new plate is done. It's not perfect, but it will do. And you set it down next to its siblings, all curved and waiting, like a row of smiles just beginning to form. The sun outside is lower now. You hear the sound of someone sweeping, probably the innkeeper's apprentice next door, brushing rice husks from the stone steps with a broom made of tied bamboo strips. And you take it as your cue to pause. Stretch your arms, roll your shoulders, take another sip of cooling tea, and stare at your work with the kind of mild satisfaction that isn't pride exactly, but something older and softer, like the contentment of knowing you've done your part in a world that rarely says thank you. Tomorrow you'll shape the top bowl of the kabuto. Tomorrow you'll deal with the rivets. But for now, the fire is low, the plates are cooling, and the helmet is one step closer to becoming real. There's a certain hour in the late afternoon, somewhere between the tail end of sunlight and the first whiff of evening damp, that doesn't exactly announce itself with bells or fanfare, but instead drifts in like a stray dog that's been here 100 times before, rubbing up against your ankles, nudging the corners of your awareness, and making everything feel just a little more golden, a little more tired, and very much like a good time to pause whatever intricate, back-hunching, wrist-cramping task you've been doing for the past 4 hours and step outside for some fresh air, or at least for a change of scenery that doesn't involve iron filings and the judgmental gaze of a half-finished cuirass. So you do. You wipe your hands on a cloth that has long since given up its battle to remain clean, slide open the wooden panel of your workshop, and step out into the narrow courtyard where your modest garden sits. if it can be called a garden really, since it mostly consists of a few overgrown patches of moss, 2 determined clumps of ginger root, a suspiciously thriving fern that you swear didn't exist last month, and a single persimmon tree that leans sideways, like it's trying to escape the whole scene entirely, though it continues, rather stubbornly, to produce exactly 3 fruits a year. No more, no less. The air smells like earth and faintly of charcoal, and you stretch your back, hearing the familiar creaks and pops of joints that have endured too many years of hammering, lifting, squatting, and sitting cross-legged for longer than any mortal body was meant to do, especially on floors that were never built with lumbar support in mind. And then, because you've always had a weakness for unnecessary detours, you decide it's time to clean the workbench. Not deeply, of course. Not the full, sweeping, reorganizing, brush out the nail box kind of clean that happens once a season, usually around the new year, when everyone suddenly decides that clutter is a spiritual toxin. But just the surface level tidy up that lets you see the wood beneath the tools, so your brain can pretend that tomorrow's tasks will start on a blank slate, even though you know full well that within 6 minutes it'll be covered in clamps, string, and little round washers that multiply like mushrooms whenever you look away. You begin with the tools, each one familiar in weight and worn down in ways that only your hands understand. The awl with the cracked cherry handle, the snub-nosed pliers whose spring gave out 2 years ago, the tiny steel brush used for cleaning rivets that now mostly serves as a cat toy for the neighbor's kitten when she sneaks in, which of course she always does, because apparently your workshop is the feline equivalent of a secret dojo/bed and breakfast. The tools go back into their grooves along the rack, where they lean together like gossiping monks, and you brush away a few rogue shavings from the day's earlier efforts, letting them fall onto the floor with the soft hiss of dry leaves, detritus of craftsmanship, sacred litter, evidence that something was shaped into existence here, even if no one outside this wall will ever notice or care. Then comes the polishing cloth, the one you use to buff the lacquer on finished pieces, gently and patiently, like you're apologizing to them for all the banging and hammering and filing that came before. And even though you're not polishing anything right now, you run it once across the surface of the bench, out of habit, the way a painter might trail their hand over a blank canvas, just to remember what readiness feels like. Outside, the light changes again. Not a dramatic shift, but a softening. The kind of quiet that deepens the shadows under the eaves and makes the clattering of sparrows in the roof tiles sound suddenly louder, more intentional, like they're debating the meaning of life or arguing over who left the millet out last winter. You sit down on the edge of the step, letting your knees crack in protest, and sip the last of your lukewarm barley tea. The taste faintly bitter, the way it always is when you forget to drink it while it's still hot. And then, as if summoned by the universal law that governs idle moments, you remember the mempo. Ah yes, the mempo, the face mask. That sneaky, complicated little component that's both a practical piece of defense and a theatrical flourish, half protection, half performance, designed not only to guard the cheeks and jaw, but also to give the wearer an expression of fierce, eternal battle readiness, often sculpted with curled lips, snarling mustaches, or furrowed brows that make the samurai look less like a man and more like a wrathful Tengu spirit on a very bad day. And of course, it's your job to make one tomorrow. You glance over at the wooden block on which you've sketched the rough design, and it glares back at you from the workbench like a face waiting to be born. A blank canvas daring you to mess it up. Historians still argue whether the more grotesque Mempo designs were meant primarily to strike fear into the hearts of enemies, or simply to mask the identity of samurai, who may have preferred a bit of anonymity when charging headfirst into an ocean of arrows. But either way, it's clear that these little iron frowns held as much psychological weight as physical use. You once made a mempo shaped like a fox snout, complete with tiny whisker slits, for a client who swore he dreamed of Inari commanding him to wear it into battle, though he later admitted it was just a fever from some bad eel stew. Still, he wore it, and still you remember it. You stand slowly, bones protesting with creaks and groans, and walk over to the mempo block, tracing your fingers along the faint groove where the nose ridge will be, imagining how the metal will bend, how the heat will bring it to life, how the lacquer will shine in the light of a setting sun, maybe under a cherry tree, maybe during a duel, maybe in 1,000 years, still sitting somewhere, waiting to be noticed again. It's strange, this quiet legacy you're building. Armor that will likely never see battle, pieces that may be worn once, maybe never. Yet still you shape each curve with care. Still you thread every chord with patience. Still you sit here on your creaky stool, in a workshop the size of a stable stall, breathing in iron dust and afternoon air, pretending that you're just doing this for the money, when really, deep down, it's about something else, something slower, something older. You exhale. The tea is gone. The light has faded just enough to turn everything a little blue. And as the cicadas begin their nightly sermons, slow at first, then building like a rising choir, you close the workshop panel, settle your tools one last time, and step back inside, where tomorrow waits, curled up in the corner of your mind, like a dog that will stretch and wake at dawn. You wake the next morning, not with a jolt or a stretch or a dramatic beam of sunlight forcing its way through the slats in your shutters, like a divine call to action, but with the sort of slow, reluctant opening of one eye that says, very plainly, we are doing this again, huh? And yes, you are. Because today is the day you start the mempo, the sculpted faceplate that will sit below the samurai's helmet, not merely as a piece of protection for the cheeks and jawline, but as a crafted mask of intimidation, one that must straddle the fine line between utility and theatrical menace, both serving the battlefield and whispering quietly to the spirits. We are not men. We are legends. It's still early. Too early for the rice porridge to be ready. Too early for the apprentice boy across the alley to start flinging water at the floorboards like he's trying to drown a ghost. Too early even for the neighborhood dogs to begin their daily war on passing carts and their wooden wheels. And yet, there you are, brushing a hand across your chin, listening to the gentle creak of your back, and knowing deep in the folds of your half-slept mind, that if you don't begin now, the mask will haunt your thoughts all day, like an unspoken haiku hovering at the tip of your tongue. You don't rush, never rush. Instead, you step lightly, gathering your tools as though greeting old friends, each one still resting where it should be on the rack from yesterday's semi-cleaning spree. The fine chisels with their worn handles that smell faintly of pine resin and patience. The small hammer with the lopsided head that no longer rings true, but strikes with a character all its own. And the coil of silk cord dyed a dull, dusty red that will eventually be used to tie the mask into place, wrapping beneath the chin and around the helmet's interior like a secret knot, holding courage to bone. The mempo begins as a simple sheet of iron, nothing glamorous or dramatic, just a curved rectangle of potential, a blank face waiting for its story. And as you place it into the brazier to heat, you prepare the wooden form it will be shaped against. A block carved decades ago by a long-dead mentor whose initials still live, scratched faintly into the base. A quiet reminder that this craft isn't yours alone, but part of a lineage that winds through generations like lacquer through fabric, unseen but binding all the same. As the metal heats, turning slowly from black to rust red to sun orange, you check your sketches. Rough outlines of the intended expression, somewhere between a snarl and a stoic frown, though you've yet to decide how exaggerated the cheekbones will be, or whether to include the tiny, utterly useless mustache plates that some samurai insisted upon, either for style or perhaps to keep insects out of their nostrils. Historians still argue about that one, believe it or not. With tongs, you lift the glowing metal from the brazier and lay it gently against the form, securing it in place with clamps and beginning the long, rhythmic process of hammering. First slow, broad taps to encourage the curve, then sharper, tighter strikes to define the nasal ridge, the hollows of the cheeks, the subtle flare of the jaw that must be wide enough to sit comfortably, yet narrow enough to stay secure during a charge or a scream or whatever mix of both battle might demand. Each blow sends a shock up your arm. Not painful exactly, but intimate, like the pulse of a friend who won't speak but insists on being heard. And as you work, you begin to fall into that peculiar trance of repetition and refinement where the noise of the outside world fades into a soft blur, and only the breath of the fire, the song of the hammer, and the slow revelation of form remain. You pause occasionally, wiping your brow with the back of your sleeve, stepping back to squint at the emerging mask, like a skeptical artist, unsure if the painting looks more like a dragon or a disappointed uncle. And you laugh quietly to yourself. Though the laugh doesn't last long, because one of the corners isn't shaping quite right, and the edge near the mouth keeps buckling inward. And the truth is, no matter how many of these you make, every single one is a puzzle with at least 3 pieces missing and 2 pieces that never belonged in the box to begin with. Still, you keep going. You switch to the finer tools now. The chasing hammer, the tiny curved chisels that let you coax out lines instead of pounding them in. And with careful, deliberate pressure, you begin to work on the details. The frown lines, the crease at the bridge of the nose, the subtle asymmetry that gives the mask character, because perfection is not the goal and never has been. It's the humanity of the flaws that makes each mempo sing, even when that song is more of a growl. Some armorers like to etch words inside their masks. Blessings, battle cries, poems to be read by no one but the wearer and maybe a curious ghost. So you take a moment to scratch something small behind the right cheek plate. 2 kanji that simply say, Yume no Naka. Within the dream, because that's what all this feels like sometimes. This craft, this life, this slow dance of fire and iron and sweat and silence. As if you've wandered into a dream that repeats itself endlessly, but always feels new. You reheat the piece, just briefly this time, to soften the metal for one final curve around the chin. And as you lift it again, you notice that your hands are shaking. Not with exhaustion, but with focus. The kind of tremble that comes not from weakness, but from intensity. Like the surface of still water when something sacred passes beneath. The final shape is there now. Raw, unlacquered, unpainted, but undeniably present. You hold it in your palms, weighing it not just in grams, but in hours, in moments, in mistakes corrected, and choices made on instinct and muscle memory alone. And you can feel the story forming around it, even if you don't yet know whose face it will frame, or whose breath will fog its interior on a cold winter morning before the charge begins. Setting it down carefully, you allow yourself one long sip of water. Cool, clear, drawn from the ceramic jug that sits beneath the window, where moss grows in patterns that might be meaningful if you stared long enough. And then you stretch again, shoulders sore, back stiff. The familiar symphony of a body that knows its trade all too well. You'll lacquer it tomorrow. Add the layers of black gloss that give it depth and mystery, and just enough shine to catch the light of a lantern in a way that makes enemies hesitate. Even if only for a second. For now, you leave it as it is. A face without a name, waiting, watching. And somehow, even though you made it, it already feels older than you are. Like it was always here, just waiting for the right set of hands to draw it into this world. You step back, let your arms fall to your sides, and exhale. Not relief, not pride, just the quiet breath of someone who knows the day has been used well. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, brushing the paper screens with a soft shudder. And you glance out the window to see the plum tree moving, just a little, as if bowing to the end of your effort. Or maybe stretching its own wooden arms in sympathy. Either way, you nod back, because some things don't need words. They just need time. And today, you gave it. When you begin layering the lacquer the following morning, there's a calm to your movements that can only come from repetition. Measured, practiced, almost ceremonial. And though the task requires a careful hand and a watchful eye, there's something undeniably meditative about the whole affair, something that slows the heart and makes the world shrink to the size of a mask, a brush, and a small clay bowl filled with urushi that glistens like wet ink in the morning light. Thick and sticky, both blessing and curse, revered for its endurance, but dreaded for its impatience with mistakes. You've worked with the hirushi for decades, and it never stops being a little unpredictable. Sometimes drying in hours, sometimes lingering tacky for days, depending on the humidity, the mood of the air, the placement of the piece, or maybe just the whim of the lacquer spirits that all craftsmen pretend not to believe in, but still mutter to when things go wrong. Because it's better to whisper apologies to an invisible force than admit you forgot to dust the mask properly before applying the first coat. Today, the lacquer behaves mostly. You hold the mempo steady with one hand, letting the other guide the brush in long, even strokes across the curved metal surface. The urushi spreading like a shadow that thickens slightly with each pass, darkening the iron, deepening the contours, softening the harshness of your hammerwork into something sleeker, almost ceremonial, as if the mask has passed through some sacred threshold from tool to symbol, from raw shape to the beginning of myth. You pause frequently, not out of fatigue, but to inspect the flow of the lacquer, how it catches the light, how it gathers in the corners and flares slightly at the edge of the cheek plate. You've learned over time that these small puddles of excess can harden into bubbles or streaks if you rush. So you resist the urge to keep moving and instead watch, breathing evenly, fingers poised like a priest mid-blessing, until you're sure it's time to continue. Outside, the light filters through the paper walls, dappling the interior of the workshop with a soft, diffused glow that makes everything feel quieter, like time itself has slowed in deference to your work. And in this hush, you begin to think about the samurai who will wear this mask, certainly, but also about the masks you've made before, each one tied invisibly to a face you may never see, a name you'll never know, all of them scattered like fallen leaves across battlefields and storehouses and museums and private shrines where children light incense and whisper thanks for ancestors they never met. One of your earliest masks, a crude, overworked piece with uneven lacquer and poorly aligned nose ridges, was worn by a young warrior whose family returned it to you years later, smoke-blackened and slightly dented. The silk cords frayed, but the eyes still fierce, still proud, still somehow intact despite all the weather and blood and time it must have endured. And even though you cringed at the flaws in your early technique, they told you he died smiling, and you believed them. That mask now sits on a shelf behind your workbench, not on display exactly, but placed with intention, a reminder of both failure and legacy, of what it means to make something that endures beyond your hands, to shape metal that will outlive your own bones and carry in some small way your fingerprint into an unknowable future. As you apply the second coat, the color deepens, a rich black with a faint reddish undertone, not glossy yet, but full of potential, like storm clouds gathering over a quiet field. And you begin to consider the finishing flourishes, the subtle red stripe along the jawline that some daimyo favor, the tiny gold rivets you could add for effect, even though they serve no functional purpose, purely decorative, purely indulgent, and yet somehow deeply necessary in the world of armor, where style and intimidation walk hand in hand like brothers whispering secrets before a duel. You'll add the mustache too. Not a real one, of course, but the sculpted ridge of bristles that curls upward at each corner like a sneer frozen in iron. A detail you once found silly, but now respect for its drama, its absurdity, its commitment to a kind of visual poetry that says, yes, I may be about to die, but I will look ridiculous and terrifying while doing it. There's an old story, probably apocryphal, about a warrior who painted tears onto the cheeks of his mempo, not out of sorrow, but as a final joke, so that when his enemies looked into his face, they saw a mask crying on his behalf, as if even his armor was exhausted by the futility of it all. Historians still argue whether that warrior existed, or whether the tears were merely smudges of ash from a hearth fire. But the story has lasted. And in this business, what lasts is what matters, not what's true. You finish the third coat by late afternoon. It glistens now, not wet, but alive. The lacquer beginning to harden into its final form, a sheen that will last for centuries if kept dry, if handled with respect, if not worn into the kind of battles where nothing survives, not even stories. You set the mask on the drying shelf, adjusting the airflow around it to ensure even curing. Too much breeze and it'll crack, too little and it'll cloud. And as you do, you feel that familiar twinge of nervous satisfaction, the thrill of nearing completion mixed with the dread that one speck of dust, one errant flywing, one clumsy bump could ruin everything and send you spiraling back to the beginning. But you let it go. You've done all you can. Now it's in the hands of time and air and the unseen spirits of craftsmanship who either bless or sabotage depending on mood or weather or the number of offerings left at the local shrine this month. With the mask drying, you turn to other tasks, less glamorous perhaps, but no less vital. Rewrapping the handle of a half-finished katana's scabbard, replacing the broken hinge on a client's armor chest, sorting through a box of decorative studs that arrived last week with a note written in a dialect you barely recognize. The characters crooked and smudged, but enthusiastic, full of gratitude and requests for future work. As your hands move from task to task, your mind remains with the mempo, picturing it worn, its curves catching torchlight, its expression half fearsome, half weary, like a soldier who has seen too much but marches anyway, because there is no other path. You think of the faces behind the masks, the lives you never see, the brother who carries the ashes home, the daughter who polishes it each spring, the temple monk who hangs it on a wall and prays for peace while war blooms again outside the gate. And you wonder, not for the first time, whether your work is truly about protection, or whether it's about memory, about giving form to the invisible, about shaping grief into something you can hold. By sunset, the mask has settled into its final shape, still too soft to handle, still days away from completion, but unmistakably whole. You light a small candle, say a quiet word of thanks, not to a god necessarily, but to the fire, to the iron, to the years of muscle and mistake and trying again that led to this moment. And then you close the workshop, letting the darkness slip in behind you, wrapping the mask in shadow and silence and the smell of slowly cooling lacquer. You step outside, stretch once beneath the sky, now streaked with violet and silver, and feel the weight of the day. Not heavy, not painful, just present. Like a cloak you wear without realizing. Tomorrow the chords, tomorrow the details. But tonight, just the knowledge that something was made, something was shaped, and somewhere, some warrior, some family, some future you will never meet, will carry a piece of you into the world. And that's enough. It always has been. It begins with a dull ache at the base of your neck. Not sharp or sudden, but persistent, like the slow dripping of a roof tile after rain. Traveling down your shoulders and into the space between your spine and your willpower. A familiar sort of tightness that you've come to accept as part of the work, as reliable as the smell of warm metal in the morning, or the whisper of rice paper when the wind slides beneath the walls of your workshop. And though you stretch occasionally, roll your shoulders, crack your knuckles one by one, like popping knotted beads on a prayer string, the discomfort never fully fades. It simply reshapes itself into the rhythm of the day, becoming just another background hum that follows you from one task to the next. This morning, you're focusing on the kote, the armored sleeves that run from shoulder to wrist, protecting the arms of a samurai while still allowing enough movement to draw, parry, and disarm in a single elegant motion, or to fall gracelessly and dramatically off a horse during a retreat, depending on the kind of day it is. And the kote, more than most pieces, demand a delicate balance between protection and flexibility, between weight and grace. And crafting them often feels more like building a story than assembling armor. You lay the components before you on the long bench, narrow iron plates, shaped and polished, sections of chainmail, hand-linked in a pattern so tight and precise it could pass for lace, if not for its faintly murderous sheen. Lengths of padded fabric dyed a deep, faded blue that always reminds you of old temple banners swaying in the wind during spring festivals. Those banners embroidered with dragons and phoenixes and poetic lines that no one ever bothers to read anymore, but still get sewn with obsessive care by monks who haven't spoken aloud in years. The process begins with the linen lining, the softest layer, the one that will rest directly against the wearer's skin, and you cut it carefully, tracing a pattern handed down through 3 generations, adjusting the measurements slightly to account for the particular client's dimensions. Not too tight at the elbow, looser near the wrist, always room for swelling and muscle strain. And as you cut, you remember the way your grandfather used to insist on this part being done in absolute silence, claiming that even idle humming could throw off the alignment, though in hindsight, it's possible he just didn't like your singing voice. Once the lining is sewn, you attach the chainmail in narrow strips down the length of the sleeve, carefully overlapping the links so they lie flat without bunching, each one looped and pinched with pliers, the click-click-click of metal against metal, forming a steady, hypnotic rhythm that feels more like a heartbeat than a sound. And as your hands work, your mind drifts, not aimlessly, but like a slow river navigating familiar bends and inlets, passing memories and theories and half-finished thoughts you've been meaning to return to since last spring. You think about how strange it is that something designed for violence can feel so delicate in your hands, how the armor you build is meant to absorb blows, to deflect swords, to stop arrows mid-flight. And yet, when you hold the components, when you stitch them together, you feel more like a tailor than a blacksmith, more like a caretaker than a craftsman. And sometimes you wonder if the samurai who wear your work understand that, if they know their armor was made by someone who once cried over a broken needle because it reminded him of his mother's embroidery, of those quiet evenings when she'd sit cross-legged under the lamp, threading plum blossoms onto handkerchiefs that nobody used. The iron plates come next, small, rectangular, slightly curved, and you lay them across the fabric in overlapping rows, like the scales of a carp swimming upstream, fastening each one with a cord of indigo silk that must be tied in precisely the right knot, tight enough to hold through movement and sweat and rain, but loose enough to flex when the arm bends, when the hand grips, when the elbow locks in the moment before impact. And you tie and test and retie over and over until the cords begin to blur together, until your fingers move without instruction, following a choreography older than thought. Outside, the day warms slowly. You hear the soft clatter of a neighbor preparing his tea, the faint rustle of wind in the persimmon tree just beyond the gate, the distant clack of wooden sandals on stone as someone walks past the shop, perhaps peering in through the open shutters, perhaps wondering what strange, monk-like figure sits hunched over a pile of metal and cloth, whispering occasionally to the sleeves as if they might talk back. Historians still argue whether cote design evolved purely for practicality, or if the increasingly ornate patterns, especially those seen during the late Edo period, were as much about status and spectacle as they were about defense, with some insisting that certain daimyo commissioned gilded chainmail and crimson silk not for battlefield use, but for parades and ceremonies meant to impress allies and terrify peasants. A theory you find believable, particularly when clients request that you stitch their clan emblem in gold thread, so large it takes up the entire forearm panel and requires the deletion of 2 protective iron strips just to make room. You've never been a fan of ornamental excess, though you admit it pays well, and whenever possible, you nudge clients toward subtlety, suggesting muted color palettes, understated motifs, symbols that whisper instead of shout, because you believe that true strength doesn't need to declare itself loudly, that sometimes the most dangerous warrior is the one whose armor creaks quietly, whose sleeves shine dully, whose cords are so tightly wound that they hold together not just the coat, but the man himself, the sleeves nearly complete. You begin the final process, applying the leather trim along the inner wrist and upper shoulder, places where friction is highest and fraying most frequent. And as you cut the strips, you remember a tidbit from an old scroll, some forgotten manual attributed to an unnamed armor master in Kyushu, claiming that goat leather, when tanned under a full moon and rubbed with camellia oil, gains a flexibility unmatched by any cowhide or deerskin, a claim dismissed by modern scholars as superstition, yet one you tested once, out of curiosity, and found surprisingly true, or at least satisfying enough to repeat. You don't know if it was the moon, the oil, or just the calm that came from working at night. But that cote, made under strange conditions, finished by lamplight while cicadas hummed in the dark, remains one of your proudest works, worn now by a distant cousin stationed on the border, someone who writes, occasionally, to tell you how it fits, how it breathes, how it feels like a second skin. When the wind is high and the sky full of birds, by late afternoon, both sleeves lie complete on the table. They are not flashy, they do not glitter, but they hold together like promises, like truths not meant to be spoken. And when you run your fingers over the last knot, tightening it one last time, you feel a quiet satisfaction, not of conquest, but of continuity. That slow, stubborn thread connecting you to every armor maker before and after. Each one sitting alone at a bench, bent over pieces of iron and silk, building something that will not save lives, necessarily, but might carry them a little further, a little safer, into the stories that come after. You stand, roll your shoulders, exhale. The pain at your neck hasn't faded, but it feels less like a burden now, more like a companion, like the gentle tap of a bird on the eaves. A reminder that you are still here, still working, still making things that matter in the quiet ways most people never see. Tomorrow you'll deliver these sleeves. Tomorrow someone will try them on and nod and say little and leave. But tonight, they rest on your bench like folded wings. Waiting, always waiting. And then, of course, it starts to rain. Not the dramatic, torrential kind that drums against the roof, like 1,000 tiny warriors marching toward an unseen siege. But that gentle, indecisive drizzle that seems unsure of whether it wants to soak the earth or merely tickle it. A slow, meandering fall of silver threads that drift sideways through the humid air, tapping lightly on the tiled roof above you and forming lazy little rivers along the edge of the eaves, where the wood has long since warped into a permanent sigh. As though even the house itself is tired of pretending to keep everything dry. You hear it before you see it. That first subtle hiss of moisture brushing against the outer wall. And you look up, not with panic exactly, but with the kind of resigned curiosity one might offer a neighbor's cat when it begins chewing the laundry again. Because you know what's coming next. Not because you're particularly clairvoyant, but because it always happens this way. The charcoal bin, left just under the overhang, begins to catch the wind-blown droplets, and within moments, the carefully dried and sifted lumps begin to darken, swell slightly, and hiss with irritation, as though protesting this intrusion into their otherwise stoic existence. You rise slowly, brush the sleeves of your tunic with a gesture that doesn't actually remove any of the iron filings clinging to it, and walk to the side of the workshop where the charcoal is kept. Not rushing, no, because nothing in your work invites haste. And besides, the rain is soft, the bin is large, and the worst that can happen is a few pieces crumble at the edges, their crisp integrity melting into damp crumbs like old cookies left in the sun. And as you reach it, you see the telltale signs, small droplets dotting the surface, a slight change in smell, a new kind of steam rising from the half-burned fragments, as though the forge is already sulking before you've even relit it. With a sigh that is part annoyance and part philosophical acceptance, you drag the lid into place. A round slab of warped wood that has survived 3 roofs, 2 floods, and 1 particularly aggressive monkey that mistook it for a drum. And as you place it gently over the bin, it gives that same hollow thunk it always gives, like a closing chapter, like a reluctant agreement between you and the weather. a mutual understanding that nothing will go as planned today. And that's probably just fine. The forge itself sits quiet now. It has not been lit since mid-morning, when the air was dry and your intentions were firmer. But now it waits, cold and patient, its belly filled with yesterday's ash and a scattering of half-burnt pine shavings that still smell faintly of the mountains where they were cut. And you crouch beside it, slowly brushing away the debris. Not because you expect to use it right this moment, but because the act itself is calming, grounding, a small ritual that brings your thoughts back from wherever they've wandered. Daydreams of lacquer drying perfectly, memories of your father humming tunelessly as he hammered shoulder guards, vague musings on whether rain that starts on a Tuesday is more melancholy than rain that starts on a Friday. Historians still argue whether rain played any role in the scheduling of feudal battles, with some claiming that particularly superstitious daimyo would avoid combat during certain lunar phases or rainy seasons, believing the water to dull sword edges or cloud the judgment of commanders, while others insist weather was merely a tactical consideration, not a mystical one. Though you, having seen what wet armor smells like after a skirmish, wouldn't blame anyone for inventing a divine excuse to delay. You lean back on your heels, brush your hands on your thighs, and glance toward the rafters, specifically toward the spot where the leak always begins, just left of the center beam, where the wood is darker and slightly bowed, like a frown held eternally in the ceiling's expression. And sure enough, the drip begins its performance. Not steady, but rhythmically irregular. A sort of lazy syncopation that splashes directly into a wooden bucket you left there weeks ago. Not because you were preparing for this moment, but because you forgot to move it after the last rain. And now it serves, unintentionally, as both receptacle and metronome for your afternoon. Drip, pause, drip, drip, longer pause, drip. The sound is oddly satisfying. You return to your workbench, though calling it work at this point may be generous, as most of the materials you'd planned to handle today are now inconveniently moisture adjacent. And so you pivot, mentally at least, to the task of sorting. Loose cords, half-finished fittings, scraps of leather too small to use, but too oddly shaped to discard. And you find yourself caught in the peculiar limbo of productive procrastination, where everything you do feels essential, yet nothing advances the actual projects waiting in the corner, like quiet accusations wrapped in silk cloth and half-assembled ambition. You take a moment to sharpen one of your chisels. Not because it's dull, really, but because sharpening gives you a reason to sit near the window, to watch the silver curtain of rain shift with the breeze, to count how many sparrows gather under the overhang near the neighboring tea house, their feathers puffed up in damp indignation, their little eyes scanning the world with the same tired suspicion you reserve for clients who say things like, "Can you just add a little gold? My uncle says it brings luck." As the stone glides across the metal edge, slow and deliberate, you think about your forge, about the way the heat licks the air when it's finally lit, about how the glow of the coals turns the entire room into something mythic, something ancient, and you wonder, briefly, if the fire mind's being extinguished, if it resents the rain, or if it simply waits, curled in on itself, knowing it will be called upon again soon, as inevitable as a bell at dawn or the quiet creak of armor being lifted from its resting place. A fringe tidbit you once read somewhere, a margin note in a cracked ledger of smithing lore, claimed that some master armorers could tell the quality of a blade, not by striking it, but by how it steamed when laid against damp cloth, the nature of the hiss and the scent of evaporating water, supposedly revealing the soul of the metal, a notion you find both absurd and poetic, and entirely believable on days like this, when everything feels slowed down, stretched out, like rice dough being pulled across a board by invisible hands. Eventually, the rain begins to thicken. Not dramatically, but with a kind of slow confidence, as though having finally decided its purpose for the day, it has committed fully, cascading now in sheets down the windows, muting the world outside, turning everything into soft shapes and vague silhouettes. The roofline of your neighbor's shed, the slumped shoulders of a willow tree, the occasional flash of someone's umbrella, bobbing past like a jellyfish in a muddy stream. You sip tea, lukewarm now, and let your thoughts drift, not toward grand things, not toward philosophy or ambition or the meaning of your work, but towards the smell of wet straw, the creak of your stool, the way the charcoal looks when it's slightly damp, and the way your hands, always dry and calloused, feel almost soft in this humidity. And you think, there are worse ways to spend a life. You think the forge will still be there tomorrow. You think, sometimes, the best kind of work is the work you almost do. And then, quite suddenly, you laugh. Just a small breath of amusement, a private joke with the weather perhaps, or with the charcoal, or with the quiet knowledge that no matter how carefully you cover the bin, the rain will always find a way to seep in, to make its presence known, to remind you that not everything must be controlled, that some afternoons are meant to be spent watching the world grow soft and silver and slow. And so you sit, chisel half sharpened, teacup half empty, and let the forge remain unlit. The charcoal damp, the armor unfinished, because in this moment, none of it is urgent. None of it demands resolution. And for once, that feels like enough. The rain doesn't stop, not right away at least, not in that sudden, dramatic way where the sun punches through like a victorious general and the birds erupt into applause, but in a more deliberate, drawn-out surrender, a gradual quieting of droplets, as though the sky itself has grown tired of the performance and is slowly packing up its instruments, leaving behind only a fine mist that lingers in the air like breath on a cold mirror, a soft shimmer that blurs the boundaries between trees, rooftops, and distant hills, making the world outside your little workshop feel both closer and farther away, like a memory that hasn't decided whether it wants to be forgotten or held on to a little longer, and it's in this liminal space between wet and dry, sound and silence, motion and stillness, that you hear it. The unmistakable clop, clop, clop of getter sandals on slick stone, that wooden percussion that announces the arrival of someone who doesn't mind getting a little damp, if it means having something to complain about later. And even before you glance up from your half-sorted cords and fraying helmet liner, You already know who it is. Because nobody walks with quite that rhythm, that uneven stomp of mild irritation, paired with the exaggerated sighs of a man who considers small talk to be a form of taxation. It's the armor dyer, or as he insists on calling himself, textile artisan specializing in protective weave pigmentation, which is a very long way of saying he boils things in vats until they turn blue and occasionally smells like vinegar for 3 consecutive days. He doesn't knock. He never knocks. He just slides the door open with the kind of theatrical grunt usually reserved for dramatic poetry readings or festival wrestlers trying to prove a point, and stands there in your doorway like a disgruntled mountain toad in human form. His conical straw hat dripping a slow waterfall onto your already damp floor. His sleeves rolled up to the elbows despite the cool weather, and his eyes scanning your workshop with the deeply skeptical expression of someone who believes you've been sitting around doing absolutely nothing all day. And, to be fair, you mostly have. You've still got that indigo I gave you, he asks, skipping any preamble as usual. You nod slowly, reaching toward the back shelf where a small bundle of cloth sits wrapped in oil paper, untouched for weeks. Not because you didn't appreciate it, but because threading new cords takes time, patience, and a specific mood that doesn't often arrive before lunch. He steps inside with the hesitation of someone entering a house that may or may not be haunted by disappointment, and you offer him a seat, which he ignores in favor of standing directly in front of your forge, staring at it with the intensity of a priest, evaluating an altar that hasn't seen incense in too long. It's not lit, he observes, in the same tone one might use to say, "There's a rat in your soup." "No," you reply, deliberately not explaining why, because some things, like rain-dampened charcoal or your desire to have a slow afternoon, don't really require justification. He sniffs dramatically. It's good weather for dyeing. He mutters, as though trying to convince himself. Rainwater makes the cloth softer. Old Master used to swear by it. Said the clouds weep the best wash. Historians still argue whether that was actually a widespread belief among traditional dyers or just an eccentricity passed down in a handful of artisan families. But you've heard stranger things. The samurai who refused to wear red cords because he dreamed once of a fox. The monk who claimed black lacquer absorbed evil thoughts. So you just nod and let the old man talk. He crouches next to your armor rack, poking at a half-finished set of sword with a finger that looks like it's spent the better part of its life, steeped in various tinctures, and makes a face somewhere between admiration and judgment. "You stitched this one too tight," he says, squinting at the seam. You don't argue because he's probably right, and because there's no point in defending a mistake you hadn't even noticed until he said it. Instead, you ask him if he brought more thread. He brightens immediately, reaching into the folds of his robe and producing 3 small bundles, each tied with delicate twine and labeled in the spidery handwriting of someone who believes that handwriting should be more difficult to read if it wants to be respected. "One's indigo," he says, pointing with the knuckle. "One's pine bark. The last is experimental. I tried adding ground oyster shells. Came out like this." You untie the last bundle, revealing a color somewhere between sea foam and apathy. Soft, washed out, vaguely resentful, and you hold it up to the light with the slow reverence one usually reserves for rare scrolls or newborn kittens. Not because the color is particularly beautiful, but because it's so strange you can't decide whether you love it or hate it. I'll take it, you say. He nods like he expected that. You don't ask what the recipe was. You've learned not to ask. Instead, you offer him a piece of rice cracker from the tin you keep under the workbench for emergencies and difficult conversations. And he takes it with a grunt that might be gratitude and might be heartburn. It's hard to tell with him. The two of you sit in silence for a while. Outside, the rain has finally stopped, replaced by that post-rain hush that feels heavier than the downpour ever did. A kind of saturated silence that clings to the trees, the walls, even your clothes, as if the world is still deciding whether to breathe again. He eventually stands, stretches his back with a crack that echoes off the walls, and picks up the oil paper-wrapped bundle you return to him. "Keep the weird one," he says. Then as he turns to go, "Let me know if it bleeds, the color, or your fingers." And with that, he's gone. Clop, clop, clop down the stone path, a trail of muddy sandal prints, marking his visit, like tiny exclamation points left behind by a very wet punctuation fairy. You sit for a while longer, unwrapping the oyster shell thread and laying it next to your usual cords, wondering how it will look against black lacquer, wondering if a samurai will notice, wondering if they'll care, wondering if any of it matters as much as the feel of it between your fingers as you stitch slowly, deliberately, into the fading light of the afternoon. You return to your bench and pick up the breastplate you abandoned earlier, your thumb brushing the edge of the lacing holes as you begin threading the new thread. Not to finish anything, not even to make progress, but simply because the act itself feels right. The way rubbing a worry stone feels right. The way sweeping leaves from the threshold in the morning feels right. Even though the wind will always bring more. You work quietly, rhythmically, the needle pushing through hole after hole, the cord whispering through, with a soft friction that feels almost alive. And you think of the dyer, of the smell of vinegar and ash and boiled roots, of the way his hands shook when he handed you the strange thread. Not from age, but from the excitement of something new. You think maybe that's what this work is. Not perfection, not history, just moments of quiet invention, moments of people trying things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it stains everything. But you keep stitching anyway, because the armor isn't just protection. It's practice, it's memory, it's ritual. And maybe, sometimes, if the clouds are right and the thread holds, it's art. It begins, as most mishaps do in your world, with a letter that arrives late, written in calligraphy, so rushed it might as well have been scratched into the rice paper with a chicken's toe, delivered by a boy who clearly doesn't know the difference between your workshop and the tofu vendor next door, and dropped on your cluttered bench between a tin of brass studs and your third half-finished cup of barley tea. You eye it with mild suspicion, not because you're expecting bad news, but because any letter that shows up unannounced is rarely the bearer of simplicity. And this one carries the vague scent of misdirection, and perfumed ink. A combination you've come to associate with one very specific type of client. The kind who knows exactly what they want until it arrives. At which point, they change their mind entirely and expect you to remake it at half the price and twice the speed. You unfold the letter slowly, the paper crackling like old lacquer under your fingers, and squint at the smudged characters until the fog of mid-morning lethargy lifts just enough for you to decipher the essential point. The crest. You were asked to embroider onto the cuirass. The carefully stitched three-leaf pattern that you completed late last night under the dim flicker of oil lamp light and moderate curses is entirely wrong. Not just a little off, not a different shade or rotated by mistake or misaligned by a hair's width. Completely. Absolutely. Unmistakably, the insignia of an enemy clan. You stare at the cuirass, still sitting on your work table like a freshly iced rice cake, flawless in every stitch, polished to the sheen of a smug moon, the wrong crest blooming on its chest, like a tattoo done on the wrong twin. You try not to swear, not because you're above it, but because it would feel redundant, like throwing salt on pickled plums. The issue, it seems, lies not with your skill, or your eyesight, or your thread, but with the scribe who wrote the original order form 3 weeks ago. A man whose handwriting resembles the dying spasms of a squid dipped in ink and tossed on parchment. He'd listed the mon of the Takanaka clan, complete with an elaborate footnote about the desired spacing between the leaves, the silk backing color, and the shape of the bordering ridge. But the client, as it turns out, is not a Takanaka. He is a Takaguchi. A Takaguchi who would rather be boiled alive in his own armor than wear the enemy's crest across his chest in the middle of a spring parade. And now, with the festival in 3 days, he is requesting, politely but firmly, that you undo the work, replace the mon, and restitch the entire section from scratch. You pause, letting the reality sink in like tea through old tatami. The mon is sewn with 5 layers of cord-backed embroidery. It took you 4 hours to align the leaf tips. You had to stop twice to get the loops right. You even bled slightly, which you considered a good omen at the time. And now it's all wrong. You do what any seasoned craftsman would do. You sigh, long and slow, not with despair, but with the kind of patience only acquired through years of accepting that every plan you make will eventually be undone by something outside your control, usually involving nobility, miscommunication, or someone's drunk uncle, with the ghost of a smile, because the absurdity is at least consistent. You fetch your smallest scissors, the ones with the tortoiseshell grip and a single nick in the blade that somehow always manages to catch the wrong thread, and begin the slow, careful process of unpicking your own precision. Stitch by stitch, you undo your labor, unraveling the hours like a monk sweeping away a sand mandala, watching the threads pool like spilled sake on the lacquered breastplate, each snip accompanied by the soft click of silk giving up its hold. It's meditative in a maddening way, like cleaning a garden during a windstorm. Halfway through, your mind begins to wander, back to that time 4 summers ago, when a merchant accidentally commissioned a helmet crest, shaped like a turnip, instead of a chrysanthemum, due to a misheard word shouted across a busy market. You spent 2 weeks sculpting it from iron, filed every vein in the leaf, only to have him arrive and burst into laughter, insisting that while it was lovely, he could never wear a vegetable into battle. He paid you, at least, and gave the crest to his cousin, who later used it as a paperweight. These things happen, more often than anyone likes to admit. Historians still argue whether Mon mistakes like these were common during the Sengoku period, especially when feudal domains shifted hands, loyalties flipped, and crest designs blurred between branches of the same family tree. But your experience suggests that human error has always been more potent than politics when it comes to embroidery. You finish removing the crest just after noon, your fingers stiff and eyes slightly blurred, and take a brief moment to mourn the artistry lost. Not because you're sentimental, but because it really did look good. Symmetrical, clean, assertive. And now it's just a blank space. A ghost of stitches where pride once bloomed. You stretch, bones creaking in sympathy with the wooden beams above you, and step outside for a moment of fresh air. The sun is finally out, filtered through a thin veil of clouds, and the alley smells of damp earth and roasted barley from the tea house at the corner. You watch a beetle climb up the side of your door frame with the determination of someone late to a duel, and you silently root for it as it nearly slips, catches itself, and continues upward, as if nothing happened. Back inside, you unroll the new Mon design. This one very clearly labeled in thick, deliberate strokes, complete with a diagram that looks like it was drawn by a nervous apprentice, using a ruler and 3 different brushes. You align it carefully on the cuirass, adjust the backing silk, and begin the slow process of stitching again, letting your hands move while your thoughts drift, letting the day pass not in excitement or drama, but in the steady rhythm of needle through cloth, thread through armor, the muted percussion of someone putting something right again. By evening, the new Mon begins to take shape. Its petals curve the right way this time. Its inner circles align. Its symmetry returns. You take a step back, examining the progress, and feel a quiet sort of pride. Not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the soft, internal nod of someone who knows they've turned an error into something usable again, who has accepted that perfection is less about never making mistakes, and more about learning how to untangle them when they inevitably appear. And then, just as you're reaching for your brush to write the tag for the finished order, you hear a knock, a rare knock, polite, tentative. You answer it with mild dread, opening the door to reveal not the client, not another confused messenger, but a small boy, maybe 8 years old, holding a cloth bundle tied with frayed twine. "Mr. Armorer," he says, bowing so fast his hat falls off. "My grandfather says, 'Thank you for fixing the family armor.' He said to give you this." You take the bundle, open it slowly, and find a pair of rice crackers, 2 small pickled plums, and a folded drawing in charcoal. Your shop, drawn from the street, smoke curling from the forge chimney, with a tiny cat asleep on the windowsill. You smile, not because the drawing is accurate, it isn't, but because it's meant to be. You offer the boy a cup of barley tea, which he politely refuses, before running off with his hat half on and a stick held like a sword, already reenacting some imagined battle where armor never breaks and crests are always stitched right the first time. You look down at the drawing again, set it beside the new moon, and think, not for the first time, that maybe the mistakes are the best part of the job. They're how you learn, how you meet people, how you get snacks, and sometimes how you end the day smiling. There is a particular kind of monotony that settles into your joints, like low fog, when you've been filing the same sword, one of the curved shoulder guards, for so long that your muscles begin to forget what it felt like to move in any other way. Your wrists locked in an eternal rhythm, your thumb rubbing the same ridge for what might be the 6th hour or maybe the 16th. You're not entirely sure anymore, as time has long since taken off its sandals and tiptoed quietly out the back door, leaving you alone with your thoughts, your metal, and the faint smell of burnt lacquer that has become, strangely, almost comforting. You sit hunched over the armor piece, like a monk over a sacred scroll, your body curled inward, nose nearly touching the metal's edge, as the rasp of your file creates that same dry, sandy whisper it has made for decades, shaving off a fraction of a millimeter with each stroke, chasing not perfection, because perfection is a myth peddled by clients who've never held a file in their life, but something close enough that a samurai's underarm won't be sliced open when he raises his elbow to adjust his top knot during a parade, because you both know that the vast majority of armor never sees battle, but it does see judgment, gossip, and the hungry eyes of rivals who know exactly how many rivets you skipped on the left sleeve. The sword you're working on is from an old set, Edo period, if you had to guess. Though historians still argue whether this style, smaller plates, tighter curve, more ornamental rivets, really began in the late 1600s, or if it was a fashion retrofitted onto earlier armor to impress the newly rich merchant class, who, despite not being allowed to carry swords, somehow always ended up wearing armor to festivals, just in case. You don't really care which theory is right. You just know this piece needs to be smoothed, polished, lacquered, and restrung before the festival in the neighboring province, where it will likely be worn by a retired rice baron who drinks too much plum wine and insists on demonstrating his kata in the middle of crowded streets, nearly decapitating lanterns with a bamboo stick, while his grandchildren clap in delight and his wife yells at him to sit down before he breaks a hip. You pause to flex your fingers, which now feel like they belong to a much older man who resents you for waking him up too early. You glance at the sword, tilt your head, and squint, because you could swear, if only for a moment, that it's starting to resemble something else entirely. Maybe a grilled mackerel, the kind with the golden, bubbling skin that curls just slightly around the edges when it's pulled from the charcoal and served on a slab of salt-stained wood. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And you wonder, idly, if that's why the last client had such a strong craving for fish when he tried it on. You'd assumed it was coincidence. But maybe the brain picks up on these things, these tiny associations, the way a single whiff of iron and vinegar can make you remember your uncle's funeral, even though you didn't like him and he owed you money. You set the file down, reach for your cup of now cold barley tea, and sip it while staring blankly into the far corner of the workshop, where a spider is building what might be its 7th web this week. Undeterred by your occasional broom swipes or loud muttering, you admire the spider's tenacity. You've considered naming it. You don't, of course, because that would be ridiculous. You're not lonely, just thorough. As you pick up the sword again, your mind drifts to a conversation you once overheard between 2 other armorers at a guild gathering in Kamakura. One of them claimed, loudly, and after his 4th cup of sake, that the ideal edge on a sword should feel like the transition between silence and a flute's first note, which made absolutely no practical sense, but sounded just poetic enough that the apprentices wrote it down as gospel. You, ever the realist, prefer a simpler standard. It shouldn't cut flesh when worn, and it shouldn't catch silk when brushed against. That's it. If you've achieved both, you've done your job. But that doesn't mean you stop trying to make it better. There's something addictive about filing metal, in a way that only someone who has done it for hundreds of hours can understand. It's like slowly erasing the past mistakes of someone else, layer by stubborn layer, until only your will remains. Polished, silent, unseen. And though no one will ever say, "This shoulder guard changed my life," there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing it won't ruin theirs. Outside, the sun has shifted. The shadows have lengthened, and the air has taken on that dusty late afternoon heaviness that makes every sound feel like it's been dipped in molasses. Somewhere, a crow is cawing in that lazy conversational tone crows use when they've got nothing better to do than remind you they exist. You don't mind it. It's company of a sort. The lacquer pot beside you is half-dried, and you know if you don't move soon, you'll have to mix another batch, which would mean standing up, finding the lacquer powder, boiling water, whispering a few curses, and spilling at least 1 ladle's worth on your sleeve. You decide to keep filing instead. This, too, is a form of wisdom. The sound changes as you near the end, the rasp giving way to a smoother shh that lets you know the edge is rounding out. You tilt the piece toward the light, inspect the shine, and run your thumb gently, carefully, along the newly filed rim. It's clean, smooth, no burrs, no grit. You resist the urge to kiss it. Instead, you reach for the cloth, the soft cotton one your aunt gave you before she moved back to the mountains, and begin the slow, deliberate process of wiping the metal clean. You buff it until the reflection returns, faint but proud, like an old man looking at his younger self in a pond. And as you set the finished piece aside, the quiet settles around you again. Thick, warm, and oddly friendly. You feel the day in your spine, in your knuckles, in the thin line across your palm where the file's handle always rubs. And you think, as you often do, that maybe it doesn't matter if the work is seen or praised or even remembered. What matters is that it's done, that the shoulder guard won't bite, that the silk will lie smooth, that the man who wears it, be he warrior, merchant, or aging show-off, will move easily without pain, and maybe, just maybe, feel safer, stronger, more himself, because of something your hands shape. And then, because it feels right, you set a small rice cracker on the bench beside the spider's web. Not because it can eat it, of course, but because some labors deserve acknowledgement, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones. It begins, as most minor disasters do in your world, with something seemingly harmless. A spool of indigo-dyed silk thread resting atop a shelf that is just a little too dusty and a little too tilted. The sunlight catching the sheen of the fibers in such a way that it almost looks violet, or maybe blue-gray, or perhaps midnight blue, depending entirely on the angle, your mood, and the state of your eyesight after 6 straight hours squinting at brass fittings. And before you know it, what should have been a simple repair job turns into a spirited, overly polite argument with the traveling thread merchant, who insists, with the confidence of someone who has never once stitched a single sleeve, that this is the exact shade you ordered last time, even though you are absolutely certain that it is not. You hold the old thread sample in one hand and the new one in the other, turning them slowly in the light, angling them toward the doorway, then toward the back wall, then why not, up toward the ceiling, hoping that a different slice of sunlight might change everything, might reveal the truth in undeniable terms. But no matter how you twist and turn them, one thing remains clear. These threads are not the same, not even close. And you wouldn't be surprised if this new spool had been dyed by a completely different family, using a different vat on a different hillside under a different moon. The merchant, whose name you always forget, and whose mustache somehow grows longer with every visit, offers the usual reassurances that dye batches vary, that humidity affects saturation, that your eyes are probably tired, that clients can't tell the difference anyway. But you're not here to please the lazy eyes of clients who only wear armor to be photographed standing next to cherry blossoms. You're here to serve the legacy of your craft, which includes the quiet, dignified rage of every armorer who has ever had to relace a full set of sword and hay date because someone delivered sapphire when you clearly asked for deep twilight. Your rebuttal is soft but firm, your tone polite but imbued with the weight of ancestral disappointment. And you lay out your case like a court poet defending the honor of a disgraced monk. That indigo thread must not veer into purple, nor flirt too closely with gray, and certainly must not possess that greenish undertone that makes it look as though it was steeped in spinach rather than fermented plant fats, because the samurai who ordered this repair served under a daimyo, with a crest the exact color of drowned dusk. And if you mess this up, the family will know, the retainers will know, and worst of all, you will know, each time you pass that suite hanging silently in the corner, judging you like a ghost, who never got the right sandals at his funeral. The merchant, bless him, tries to diffuse the situation with a joke about how the thread matches the color of your mood. And you do not laugh, not because it wasn't funny, it wasn't, but because you're busy holding both spools up to your nose, pretending to sniff them for subtle scent differences, while buying time to summon your next point of attack. It is, after all, important to maintain decorum. You are not a common carpenter. You are not a rice vendor haggling over bags in the market square. You are an armor maker, a profession that straddles the line between art and death. And as such, you take your pigments seriously. You offer to walk with him to the back alley where the sun hits at just the right angle between the eaves of your neighbor's tea house and the shrine wall. And together, you hold the two threads against a flat stone. And there, in that sacred slice of afternoon light, you both see it clearly. The old thread glows with the quiet depth of a twilight pond, while the new thread sulks with the vague indecision of a bruised plum. He sighs. You raise an eyebrow. He concedes. He does not apologize, of course, because he is a merchant and must maintain the illusion of unerring confidence. But he promises to return with the proper dye lot within 3 days, maybe 4, if the road to the dye village is flooded again, which it often is this time of year, and you nod graciously, because that's the game, isn't it? You complain. He resists. You threaten not to buy from him again. He pretends not to care. You both walk away, feeling slightly annoyed and vaguely victorious. Tradition is preserved. After he leaves, you return to the workshop and carefully wrap the old thread around a piece of pine wood, labeling it in your neat, nearly illegible handwriting. Indigo. Task Series, number 3, Summer Batch. You place it in the drawer beside 5 other spools that once sparked similar debates, each one resting like a relic from a temple of dying hues. All slightly different, all absolutely not interchangeable. You shake your head and laugh, softly this time, because you know no one else would care. And yet somehow, that makes it more important that you do. You glance at the half-finished chess piece resting on the workbench, its silk lacings paused mid-pattern, waiting for a verdict that only the thread can deliver. You touch the edge of the armor, the cool lacquered plates catching the light, just so. And you think about how color is memory, how a thread shade tells a story more subtle than words, more stubborn than steel, how the wrong tint can ruin a mood, undermine an oath, insult a family, and how your job, ridiculous as it may seem to some, is to keep those tiny, invisible oaths alive. Historians still argue whether color regulations among samurai were strictly enforced or more symbolic, depending on the region and period. But you've seen the look in a client's eye when a thread tone is even slightly off. It's the same look someone gives when offered the wrong incense at a shrine, or when a relative calls you by the wrong childhood nickname. And that kind of wound, though minor on the surface, bleeds a long time in the heart. And it's not just samurai who care. You once had a farmer's son commission a small domaru for a festival parade, and he was very clear, almost aggressively so, that the threads must match the exact color of his mother's prayer beads, which he brought in a sack for comparison, setting them down like sacred treasure. The memory still makes you smile. That boy was earnest and wrong. His mother's beads were faded green, not indigo, but you match them anyway, because to him, that color meant protection. The workshop feels quieter after the merchant's departure. You sit back down, the stool creaking its usual protest, and decide to take a break before starting anything new. Your hands rest in your lap, still tingling slightly from the thread wrapping, and your gaze drifts toward the rafters, where a single strand of spider silk catches the light and shimmers with the kind of iridescence you know you'll never find in a dye shop. You wonder, briefly, if anyone has ever tried to use spider silk as armor thread. Probably not. Too fine, too fragile. But it's nice to imagine a suit laced with something spun directly from nature, from patience, from geometry and wind. You breathe out slowly, letting the thought go and reach for your tea. It's cold. It always is. The day had already been long before he arrived. Long in that drawn-out, sigh-heavy way that doesn't depend on what time the sun says it is, but rather on the slow churn of the brain and the creak of your knees each time you stand up from the low bench near the forge. But the moment you hear the unmistakable clatter of wooden sandals in a zigzag pattern down the alley, accompanied by an off-key hum of a song that was probably never meant to be hummed in the first place, you know with deep and irrefutable certainty that the village drunk is about to grace you with one of his infamous unsolicited visits, which, like earthquakes or bee swarms, cannot be avoided, only endured with the calm resignation of a man whose tea was already cold, and whose patience has long since been lacquered over and stored in a drawer labeled "Things we do not talk about" before sunset. He enters without knocking. He never knocks, and announces himself not with words, but with a dramatic exhalation, the kind that suggests he has just returned from war, or possibly a pilgrimage, or perhaps just the next street, over where someone refused to let him finish their leftover mochi. His kimono is half slit from one shoulder. His hair has achieved that special harmony between tangled and sculptural, and the gourd tied to his belt is swaying with enough liquid momentum to make you wonder whether he's brought sake, soup, or just the rainwater that collects in his shoes. Ah, my iron-fisted philosopher. He bellows, naming you as he always does, in tones far too grand for a workshop that smells of scorched glue and dusty silk, and before you can respond, he plops himself down on the floor beside the unfinished armor stand, as though he's a vital part of the process, crossing his legs with exaggerated care and pulling from the folds of his robe a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, which he then opens to reveal 3 dried persimmons, a small ivory comb, and what looks suspiciously like half a prayer scroll. This, he declares, holding up the persimmons like a merchant presenting rare jewels, is for the helmet god. And this, he continues, gesturing vaguely to the comb, is for the armor's wife. And this, he adds, waving the scroll fragment with flair, is mine, because I'm still negotiating with the spirits who stole my sandals last spring. You do not argue with him. Arguing, you have learned, is not only pointless, but also serves as a kind of ritual encouragement, like watering a weed, and the more you correct him, the more elaborate his stories become, growing taller and drunker with every detail. So instead, you nod solemnly, accept the offerings with theatrical reverence, and place them in a small bowl on the edge of the workbench that has unofficially become the repository for all things he insists on gifting. A cracked ceramic beetle, a pebble shaped like a sleeping rat, and a tooth that may or may not have belonged to a monkey. He eyes the chest plate you've been working on with a look that suggests he's about to tell you how it reminds him of an ex-lover or a dream he once had about a turtle. But instead, to your surprise, he goes quiet for a moment, squinting at the lacing pattern with the faint recognition of someone who, at some point long ago, might have known what they were looking at. It's easy to forget, during these visits, that he was once an Ashigaru foot soldier, or so he claims, one of those half-trained conscripts who marched under someone else's banner and learned quickly how to avoid arrows, mud, and responsibility in equal measure. Whether he actually fought or simply loitered near battles is still unclear. But every once in a while, his eyes catch on a detail in your work with a glint that seems just sober enough to be real. I used to wear those cords backward, he mutters, mostly to himself. They told me it was bad luck, but I said luck was already bad the day I signed up. You nod again, this time with less patience and more curiosity. But before you can ask anything, he's back to rummaging in his robe for another treasure, this time producing a tiny paper fan with a painted Oni face on one side and a crude haiku on the other, which he reads aloud with great pride. Red as iron cheeks, wind from sandals of the fox. Why did she leave me? You have no idea who she is, or if she even existed, or whether this is actually his poem or something he found scrawled on a bathhouse wall. But you offer a slow clap nonetheless, because part of the unwritten armor maker's code is to respect any man willing to bear his soul in the form of bad poetry, while slightly inebriated and surrounded by dangerous tools. He then insists, as he always does, on helping with your current project, which typically means touching things he shouldn't and asking questions he won't remember the answers to. Today, however, he surprises you by pulling out a single coin, copper, dented, probably forged under a regional mint that no longer exists, and offers it as payment for the blessing of your presence, which you accept, partly because it's easier than refusing, and partly because it's the most intact coin he's ever tried to give you. Historians still argue whether village armor makers, like yourself, were formally recognized craftsmen with samurai status, or simply glorified blacksmiths with better calligraphy. But either way, you know that your relationship with clients, especially the wandering, intoxicated ones, is often more about performance than practicality. And this performance, absurd as it may be, maintains a kind of cosmic balance in the workshop. You endure his stories, and in return, he reminds you that even the serious things you make, arm guards, thigh plates, back crests, are ultimately worn by people who bleed, joke, and occasionally forget which way their helmet is supposed to face. Eventually, he dozes off, head tilted back against the wall, mouth open in a snore that harmonizes unexpectedly well with the rhythm of your hammering. You continue working for a while, letting the sounds of labor and dreaming intermingle, the weight of silence occasionally broken by one of his twitching limbs or a half-mumbled word about frogs. You don't wake him. There's no point. He'll leave when his dreams change scenery, when his feet remember they belong to someone, when the gourd runs dry, or the sun shifts through the paper window just enough to bother his eyelids. In the meantime, you finish tying the cords on the hay date and set them aside, noticing that your movements have slowed, not from exhaustion exactly, but from the strange calm that settles when a room, for all its oddities, feels complete. One half order, one half chaos, both necessary. When he finally stirs, he leaves as unceremoniously as he arrived, taking with him the paper fan, 2 of the persimmons, which he forgot he gave you, and the coin, which he forgot he gave you, then asked for as a loan. You say nothing. You bow politely. You return to your work, and later, as the light outside turns the lacquer on your tools to something almost golden, you realize he never actually told you his Oni story this time. The one about the flying demon made of tin and smoke that tried to sell him batsake during a thunderstorm. A shame, you think. That one was your favorite. There's a particular kind of splinter that doesn't just lodge itself under your skin, but somehow manages to wedge its entire essence into the narrative of your day, turning from a mere inconvenience into a symbol of something larger and vaguely existential. And today, while you're crouched at your workbench, surrounded by strips of rawhide, bronze studs, and the echo of half-finished complaints from a client who's already 3 weeks late, picking up his shoulder guards, you find yourself in an unexpected battle with precisely that kind of splinter. A tiny, almost invisible sliver of pine that entered your thumb during a moment so mundane you've already forgotten what you were even doing, and now refuses, stubbornly and with great ceremony, to come back out. At first, of course, you pretend it's nothing, just a sting, a prick, a little pinhole of annoyance not worth your attention. Because you've spent years working with blades, lacquers, and glowing hot metal, and your tolerance for pain has grown in strange ways, like those bonsai trees that twist into peculiar shapes, not because it's natural, but because someone trained them that way with wire and patience. But soon you realize it's not going to go away on its own, because each time you press your thumb into the wrapping cord or try to pick up a sliver of horn for the decorative rivets, the pain flares in a precise and personal way, like a tiny messenger with a very loud voice delivering the same unpleasant news. You are no longer in control of your own thumb. You try the usual methods, pinching the flesh around it, pressing with a fingernail to coax it to the surface, even attempting to ignore it while casually rubbing the pad of your thumb on a rough stone. But it remains unmoved, perhaps even more entrenched, like a stubborn elder at a village meeting who refuses to acknowledge new ideas simply because they weren't written down in the scrolls 200 years ago. Eventually, with the resignation of a man who knows this is going to take longer than it should, you fetch the little bone needle from your lacquered toolbox, the one your grandfather used not for sewing, but for removing precisely this sort of dishonorable, minute invader, and sit down cross-legged near the window, where the light is soft and indifferent, as if politely declining to help you but willing to watch. You begin the extraction with all the gravitas of a battlefield surgeon, slowly scraping back a bit of skin, breathing evenly, holding your thumb close to your face in a position that makes you look mildly absurd. And as the minutes pass, 10, 20, perhaps more, you fall into a kind of meditative rhythm, not because it helps, but because when you've spent this much time chasing a piece of wood the size of a flea's tooth, your brain starts trying to make it mean something bigger, something grander, something spiritual even, and you begin to wonder, is this splinter, this maddening intruder, not merely a punishment for carelessness, but a message from the ancestors? Historians still argue whether samurai craftsmen held any sort of formal connection to the spiritual world beyond the typical household shrines, and seasonal offerings. But many old texts suggest that armor making, particularly when practiced alone, invited the kind of quiet that borders on sacred. And you've often wondered whether the silence that fills your workshop isn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something older. An agreement, perhaps, between yourself and the material world. One that allows you to mold iron and leather in exchange for small but constant irritations like this one. The needle slips. You hiss through your teeth. The splinter laughs, inaudibly but unmistakably. Outside, a sparrow hops along the stone sill, watching you with the mild judgment of a creature that builds its home entirely from sticks and still manages to avoid injury. You consider asking it for advice, then think better of it. Birds don't negotiate with thumb wounds. You decide to soak the thumb. You pour a little warm water into a lacquered bowl, technically meant for soup, but everything in your workshop serves at least 2 functions, and add a pinch of powdered camphor, not because it helps, but because your grandmother swore by it. And sometimes superstition works better than logic. You dip your thumb into the mixture and wait, watching the skin soften, the light shift, the steam rise like incense from a shrine no one visits anymore. And somehow, after what feels like the passage of a minor dynasty, the edge of the splinter appears, a dark line just beneath the surface, like the mast of a ship emerging from mist. And you breathe out slowly, guiding the needle with the trembling precision of someone diffusing a bomb made of bark, until at last it slides free, sticky with blood and triumph, and you hold it aloft like a sacred relic. The kind monks would encase in crystal and pilgrims would travel miles to glimpse, just for a second. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's perfect. You wipe your thumb clean, bandage it with a strip of linen dyed blue with the leftover thread from that disastrous indigo merchant argument, and sit back, sighing so deeply your ribs creak. The splinter, still resting on the edge of your tray, gleams faintly in the light, not in victory, but in acknowledgement of the war it waged. And then you laugh. Because of course, this is the thing that would derail your afternoon. Not the forge failing to heat properly, not the missing crest from the courier, not even the armor dyer's wild theory about turning beet juice into lacquer pigment. No, it's a splinter. One tiny piece of tree. One whisper of pain. One invader that required a spiritual journey and a full 30 minutes of your increasingly precious time. You place it carefully in a small wooden box alongside a collection of equally strange keepsakes. The broken awl you swore you'd throw away last winter, a single molar from a wild boar your uncle gifted you as a joke, and a shell from the time you tried to vacation near the sea and ended up caught in a storm with 3 monks and a sack of pickled plums. These things matter, somehow, not because they're useful, but because they remind you that the life of a craftsman, especially one who spends his days alone, weaving thread through iron and lacquer through silence, is composed not of great moments or sweeping gestures, but of tiny events, annoyances, accidents, absurdities that accumulate like the layers of a kabuto, eventually forming something surprisingly durable, even beautiful, if only from the right angle. You return to your workbench, thumb now thick with bandage and pride, and resume stitching the decorative knot on a thigh plate, feeling the pull of the silk against your fingers, the faint ache in your shoulder from having sat too long, the renewed peace of knowing the workshop is quiet again. No clients, no birds, no splinters, just you, the cord, the curve of the armor, and the faint echo of your earlier sigh still caught in the window pane like a forgotten breeze. The drawer in the far left corner of your workshop, the one that sticks every time you try to open it, the one that lets out a reluctant creak, like an elderly man settling into a cold bath, holds more than just the broken tools you've been meaning to sort through for years. It holds a quietly embarrassing history of your reluctance to let go, a small museum of minor failures and half-hearted promises to fix it someday. And today, with the kind of reluctant determination usually reserved for dusting altar shelves or trimming your own nose hair, you decide to face it. You kneel down, brushing aside a trail of wood shavings and a few stray silkworm cocoons that got loose the last time the dye merchant came to trade stories and forgot to close his basket. And you tug at the stubborn drawer until it finally yields with a groan, revealing what could generously be called a collection, and more honestly be described as a graveyard. Blunt chisels with splintered handles, bent awls that once carved perfect stitch holes through boiled leather, rusted pincers whose grip has long since grown slack, and one particularly pathetic hammer that snapped at the neck during a midsummer attempt to reshape a helm that absolutely did not want to be reshaped. Each object carries a memory, not always fond, but always vivid. The chisel you broke during a rush order for a daimyo's nephew who wanted his sunny polished to mirror brightness, even though he'd never seen combat. The awl you dropped in a stream while cleaning your tools after a temple commission and later retrieved with a stick and an expletive. The pincers you lent to your apprentice, whichever one it was at the time, and received back with an apologetic shrug and no explanation except a suspiciously burnt spot on the handle. The hammer, whose demise coincided with a day you'd rather forget entirely, involving a clogged chimney, a spoiled fish lunch, and an unexpected visit from your least favorite inspector. You pick each tool up slowly, weighing it in your hand, testing its balance, remembering the way it once behaved when you asked it to do its job, before time, wear, and your own occasionally careless strength rendered it unfit for the precision your work demands. Some of these, you realize, you've already replaced, bought new versions from the forge across the district, or fashioned makeshift substitutes from salvaged iron. But you kept the old ones anyway, out of habit, out of respect, or out of some vague sense that to throw them away would be to discard a piece of your own experience, your own stubborn learning curve, your own quiet legacy of imperfect craftsmanship. Historians still argue whether craftsmen of the Sengoku period were as reverent of their tools as later Edo-era artisans. But among armor makers, at least, it was not uncommon to see worn-out implements wrapped in cloth and stored with a kind of solemnity, almost like ancestors whose usefulness had ended, but whose presence was still somehow necessary. You take a cloth and begin wiping down the worst of the grime. Not because you expect to restore them, but because dust, like regret, sits heavy if left untouched too long. The chisel, once cleaned, reveals a faint engraving, your master's mark still visible under the corrosion, and you pause for a moment, remembering his hands, his voice, the way he could silence an entire workshop with a single cough, the way he used to tell you that a well-kept tool was a better legacy than a well-paid client, which at the time you thought was nonsense, but now makes a certain poetic sense, especially on days when your joints ache and your eyesight betrays you, and you wonder who will care about your work when you're gone. You place that chisel to the side. It deserves a little shelf. You continue sorting. One by one, you divide the tools into two piles. Those that might, just might, be worth restoring, and those whose fate is now symbolic, their purpose transformed from utility to memory, from function to meaning, from use to make, to made me who I am. Among the broken bits of metal and wood, you find a curved needle, your first attempt at making one yourself, and laugh softly, remembering how you bent it over the edge of your tea kettle because the forge fire intimidated you, and how the result was so crooked it looked like it had been chewed on by a raccoon with personal issues. You find a pair of tongs with mismatched arms, still bearing the burn mark from when you left them in the embers overnight, and forgot until you smelled the handles smoldering in the morning. And next to them, tucked in a folded piece of yellowed rice paper, is a single note in your own handwriting from decades ago. Never do this again. Spoiler alert, you did it again. Twice. You considered throwing them away. You don't. Instead, you gather a few pieces of soft cloth, the kind used to wrap delicate sword hilts or line the inside of an ornamental kabuto, and begin wrapping each retired tool like a small shrine offering, not out of necessity, but out of gratitude. Because even though they no longer perform their tasks, they remind you of every lesson you didn't want to learn, but had to. Every shortcut that didn't work out. Every hard-earned callus that formed the long, slow way. Outside, the sun shifts lower in the sky, casting golden lines across the floorboards, and the workshop smells faintly of oil, wood dust, and something almost citrusy. Perhaps from the orange peels your neighbor left near the window to dry, which you now realize have been attracting a small group of very confused ants. You look up, then around, and for a moment everything is still. There's peace in inventory, you think. Not because it solves anything, but because it reminds you what you've already survived. You return the wrapped tools to the drawer, now tidied, organized, labeled with little slips of washi paper that say things like blunt but honest and cut me once, shame on you, and one labeled simply why, which you feel needs no further clarification. The drawer closes more smoothly now, as if grateful, as if it too needed this moment of attention, this ritual of acknowledgement, this quiet little ceremony of remembering the things that break and what they leave behind. You sit back on your heels, stretch your shoulders, roll your neck, and let out a sound, somewhere between a sigh and a grunt, the universal language of aging craftsmen everywhere. There is still much to do. The day is far from over, but for now you have honored what needed honoring. cleaned what could be cleaned, forgiven what could not be fixed. And that, perhaps, is enough. There are objects in your workshop that never move, not because they're nailed down, and not because they're forgotten, but because their presence is so constant, so foundational, that touching them would feel like disturbing a sacred weight. And none of those objects carries more of that heavy, humming stillness than the old anvil at the far side of your forge. The one that sits slightly off-center, dented along its edge like the brow of a tired warrior, its surface polished not by cloth, but by decades of deliberate, repetitive, utterly human impact. It is, quite literally, the heart of your trade. And unlike the dozens of little tools that have come and gone, been dropped, replaced, broken, or improved, the anvil is the one thing that endures from one generation to the next. And this one, this particular lump of blackened iron and tempered silence, belonged to your grandfather before you, and to his father before that. And though historians still argue whether armorers in the Muromachi period treated anvils as heirlooms or simply as hardware, the grooves and scorch marks etched into this one say more than any scroll ever could. You don't often speak aloud to it, only when particularly frustrated, or when a nail ricochets with the kind of spite that makes you believe tools do in fact have a sense of humor. But every day, without fail, you acknowledge it with your eyes, with your hands, and with your body, adjusting your posture as you approach, like a bow made without thinking, a gesture that exists not because it's required, but because not doing it would feel like forgetting to breathe. Today, as the late afternoon light slants across the floor in golden rectangles, you find yourself drawn toward it, not by duty, but by memory. And as you brush away a few loose threads and the tiniest dusting of ash, you let your fingers rest against the metal, cool but not cold, solid but not harsh, as if the anvil, in all its permanence, had decided long ago to be gentle with those who respected it. You remember your grandfather's hands, the way they moved like wind over water, deceptively soft, but carrying the strength of someone who had hammered thousands of rivets and forged thousands of scales. And you remember the smell of his workshop, camphor and burnt oil, wood shavings and sweat, and how he used to talk to the anvil as if it were an old friend, sometimes praising it, sometimes warning it not to betray him. And once you swear, apologizing to it after a bad day, when his temper got the better of him, and he struck a heated plate too hard, sending sparks flying and splitting a metal seam that had taken all morning to weld. You sit beside it now, just for a moment, resting on the short stool your father built, when your knees first started complaining about crouching, and you trace the oldest dent with the tip of your thumb, imagining the first strike that made it. Was it a swordsmith? An armorer? A village blacksmith fixing a cooking pot? The truth is lost to time. And yet the impression remains, stubborn and specific, like a memory carved into flesh. The anvil doesn't speak, of course, but if it did, it would have stories to tell, of feudal lords with more money than sense, of apprentice hands trembling under pressure, of forgotten battles and parades that never happened, of summer days when the fire burned too hot, and winter nights when it refused to light at all. of you as a child, trying to lift a hammer too heavy for your wrist, of your father's last job before his fingers gave out, of every moment when the clank of metal against metal was more than just a sound. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat shared between flesh and forge. It's not just an object you think, it's a witness. And even now, as you sit in the quiet of your workshop, the air thick with the faint smell of ash and mulberry oil, you can almost feel it listening, not judging, not intervening, just absorbing, as it always has, everything you give it. Outside, a breeze stirs the edge of a tarp you forgot to tie down, and a single leaf skitters across the floorboards like a mouse late to a tea ceremony. But you remain still, your hand resting gently on the anvil's surface, not because you expect it to respond, but because in this exact moment, doing anything else would feel too loud. You consider briefly how strange it is that a life can orbit so steadily around one fixed object, that all your days, from sunrise sweeping to nightfall tea drinking, are measured not in steps or meals, but in hammer strikes and metal echoes. And you wonder, not for the first time, what will happen when your hands no longer obey you, when your eyes blur the difference between copper and bronze, when the heat of the forge is more curse than comfort. Will someone inherit this? Will they recognize its worth? Or will they see only a lump of iron, outdated and heavy, and leave it to rust? You shake your head. No, you're not that far gone yet. But you do find yourself lingering now, more than you used to, watching the way the light reflects off the worn grooves, the way the edge curves just slightly, where the base has been struck too often by distracted hands, the way even imperfections have become part of its beauty, like wrinkles on a beloved face, or the squeaky hinge of a door that's always opened for you. And you remember, with a slow smile, the time your cousin, visiting from the city, loud and smug and full of ideas, tried to lift it, claiming it couldn't possibly be that heavy, and how he strained and grunted and eventually declared it impractically symbolic, and how you didn't correct him, because honestly, he wasn't wrong. It is symbolic, but it's also practical. It is both burden and foundation, both challenge and comfort. And as you sit there, the minutes drifting like incense smoke, you realize that you have spent more of your life beside this anvil than beside any person, more time trusting its stillness than any promise, more time in its presence than in temples or bathhouses or fields. And you are not alone in that. Across the centuries, there have been thousands like you. Craftsmen, armorers, metalworkers, caretakers of tradition, who bent over these same shapes, whispered curses when iron cracked, whispered prayers when orders piled up, whispered nothing at all when grief made even metal seem too soft. And though history barely remembers their names, their work remains, their rhythm remains, and somewhere, perhaps, their anvils still ring. You rise eventually, not because you want to leave, but because the day does not wait. And the evening chores, though few, still hum at the edge of your awareness. You bow your head, just slightly, not a ceremony, not a ritual, but something quieter than both. And then you step away. The anvil stays, as it always has, as it always will. You always tell yourself that today will be the day you finish a full set. That maybe, just maybe, All the plates will align, the cords will sit flat, and no thread will break at the last possible moment. But by the time the sun has begun to slide down the back of the hill, and the cicadas trade shifts with the tree frogs, the truth reveals itself, as it always does, in the soft shuffle of half-finished armor tucked quietly back onto the lacquered racks. Shoulders still unstrapped, helmets missing their crests, gauntlets stubbornly unstitched, and the breastplate sitting upright like a silent spectator of your daily ritual of nearly finishing. The day ends, not with triumph or finality, but with a long exhale you didn't know you'd been holding, your hands hovering above the workbench for one last moment, hovering over nothing in particular, simply refusing to declare the job done because deep down you already know it isn't, and probably won't be. At least not today. There's a kind of beauty in that if you squint your mind the right way. In this slow dance between effort and delay, between craftsmanship and compromise, in this lingering twilight hour when the tools begin to look like sleeping animals, and even the charcoal seems to sigh, exhausted by your indecision to either continue or let go. You pick up a cup of tea that's been cooling beside your elbow since just after the 3rd hour of the afternoon. Oolong steeped twice, slightly bitter now, but still familiar. And take a sip that tastes more like obligation than refreshment. A symbolic gesture to mark the descent into evening. Because if you don't at least pretend to pause, the work will pretend it owns you. Your joints creak as you stand, and the floor beneath your bare feet greets you with the familiar dusty chill of old wooden planks. Boards worn smooth, not by polish, but by repetition, by decades of pacing and squatting and shifting and leaning and crouching and rising again. The choreography of a life built around pieces that never quite assemble themselves, no matter how many times you think you've streamlined the process. You don't bother cleaning everything up. Not anymore. Long ago, in your apprentice days, you would have spent 30 careful minutes oiling each tool, stacking the plates by size, sweeping away each sliver of wood and metal shavings, as if cleanliness itself would bring you closer to perfection. But now you know that tomorrow's mess begins with tonight's tidy up. And it's easier, kinder even, to let the day remain visible in the clutter. A curled thread on the floor, a cloth half folded, a whetstone still damp from your morning sharpening, the ash from a burnt twig lazily clinging to the rim of the forge. And anyway, no one else is watching. There is no lord knocking on your door for inspection, no master leaning over your shoulder with narrowed eyes, no rival eager to find fault in the way you store your mallets or hang your kabuto. And even if there were, you doubt they'd notice the tiny ways in which the room has come to reflect not just your habits, but your mind. Scattered in some places, precise in others, always returning to the same few corners out of comfort or muscle memory. Outside, the first evening breeze slips through the paper window panel you never managed to patch, tugging playfully at a hanging strand of red silk cord that flutters like a forgotten prayer ribbon. And for a moment, you wonder whether you should fix it tonight or simply add it to tomorrow's ever-expanding list. Tomorrow, the eternal scapegoat of unfinished tasks. You smile, thin and private, and decide to do nothing at all, at least for now. Instead, you shuffle to the corner where the kettle rests on its clay stand, pour a little more tea, and settle down on the step that leads into the narrow garden beyond your workshop, where moonlight is beginning to pool in the hollows between stones, and a cricket, always the same one you think, or perhaps its equally opinionated descendant, resumes its nightly commentary on the state of the world, which to your ears sounds something like, "You still haven't finished that sword, have you?" And you haven't. Of course you haven't. That shoulder guard, like so many other pieces, lies in limbo, too close to completion to abandon entirely, too flawed to celebrate. Its edges filed, but not polished. The silk binding half-stitched and slightly uneven, where your attention wandered during the noon hour when the neighbor's dog refused to stop barking at the wind. You tried to ignore it, but the dog won and the cord lost. And now here you are, sitting in your own personal museum of incomplete intentions, staring out at a sky that has already decided to move on from the day, stars emerging in careful procession, as if mocking your inability to do the same. You tilt your head back, sip your lukewarm tea, and wonder, because you often do, especially at this time of day, what all this labor amounts to. Does it matter if the plates shine? If the cords match? If the helmet crest faces exactly true north? You think about the armors that have left your hands in the past 10 years, about the lords and sons and hopeful young warriors who collected them with pride or boredom or mild annoyance, about the ones who left thank you gifts or letters, or more often, nothing at all. And you wonder how many of those pieces ever saw real battle, and how many simply gathered dust in ceremonial halls until moths or mold took them apart faster than any enemy blade could. Historians still argue whether the average foot soldier in the late Edo period wore armor forged to function or merely to impress, whether the lacquer and cord served the spirit or the spectacle. And though you have your suspicions, you've long since given up trying to classify your own work as either art or utility. It is both, and neither, and it is yours. And that's all the clarity you expect anymore. You sip again. The tea is now cold. It tastes better somehow, less demanding. You shift your weight and your back makes a noise like an old temple gate. Across the street, a neighbor lowers a paper shutter. A moth flutters by and bums into your forehead, as if trying to nudge you inside. The garden smells of moss and iron and something faintly like ink. You close your eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, really listen, to the tiny symphony of nighttime sounds that wrap around your little workshop, like a blanket made of memory and resignation. The creak of the bamboo spout tipping back into its stone basin, the soft tap of a cord against the wall, the near silent stretch of a spider web growing in the corner you've been meaning to clean for 3 days, but won't. You breathe in, slow and shallow. The world continues. The armor does not finish itself. The workshop is not perfect. The cords are slightly mismatched, but the forge, just behind you, still holds a trace of heat. And the tools, those tired, loyal tools, are waiting, exactly where you left them, exactly where you'll find them tomorrow. Nothing is complete, and maybe that's enough. You don't often talk about your dreams, mostly because you don't think they're particularly interesting, and partly because, in truth, you're never quite sure whether you're dreaming at all or simply wandering half asleep. through the leftover thoughts of a day spent sanding, stitching, and waiting for lacquer to dry. But tonight, as you lower yourself onto the thin futon in the corner of the workshop, the air around you still carrying a whisper of iron filings and boiled silk, your thoughts drift in that soft, uncertain way toward the idea of what becomes of all this armor once it leaves your hands. And for a moment, just a moment, the space between imagination and memory grows wonderfully thin. You wonder, not for the first time, whether any of the cuirasses you've so carefully constructed, lacquered in 10 thin coats, dried across 3 moon cycles, wrapped in cords you personally dyed and threaded and tied, have ever truly stopped a blade, deflected an arrow, absorbed the crushing weight of a Yari thrust in battle, or whether they've mostly been worn in procession, admired at festivals, or displayed in shogunate halls as part of a proud retainer's inventory, ceremonial rather than practical, symbols of readiness rather than instruments of survival. The thought used to trouble you, this quiet possibility that your life's labor might serve more for appearances than for purpose. But over time, it has grown almost comforting, like an old friend who never answers your questions, but is always happy to listen to them, especially late at night when the forge is cold and the only sound in the room is the paper wall, softly reacting to the breath of the wind. You've never been to battle yourself, and you likely never will. Your hands are calloused in the wrong places for sword play, your knees more accustomed to crouching beside a brazier than leaping into the fray. But that hasn't stopped you from imagining, in the deep hush of early night, how your work might move in the world beyond your small corner of it. Perhaps one of your helmets once saved a young warrior's skull when he fell from a horse in the middle of a skirmish on a muddy hillside. Perhaps your arm guards absorbed the clumsy blow of a bandit too drunk to swing properly. Or maybe, more realistically, your armor helped someone simply feel stronger, braver, more worthy of the title samurai. If only for the duration of a parade. Historians still argue whether the armor worn by lower-ranked warriors in the later Edo period was ever meant for real combat at all, or whether by then it had become little more than a form of visual etiquette, a polite nod to older times, much like the way you still bow to your tools before beginning work each morning. Not because they demand it, but because it feels strange not to. You shift under the thin blanket, the rough edges of sleep beginning to close in around your limbs. But your mind continues to wander, latching onto a memory that visits you more often than you care to admit. The first armor you ever finished alone, not as an apprentice or assistant, but as a full craftsman. Your name signed discreetly in ink on the inside of the chest plate, visible only to the wearer, or the unfortunate monk tasked with preparing it for burial. You remember the excitement of that moment, how you'd waited until well after midnight to polish the final plate, how your hands had trembled, not from exhaustion, but from reverence, and how, when the client arrived 2 days later to collect it, he barely looked at the details, barely nodded in appreciation, merely handed over a wrapped parcel of rice and pickled plums, and walked away, already distracted by some errand more urgent than acknowledging your painstaking efforts. That night, you sat awake, staring at the empty rack where the armor had hung for weeks, and though you tried to feel proud, all you felt was the silence it left behind. And yet, despite the silence, or perhaps because of it, you made another, and another, and another after that, because the work itself is a kind of conversation. Even if the responses are slow or non-existent, and in that quiet exchange between material and intention, you found something that almost resembles meaning, or at least a rhythm stable enough to live within. The ceiling creaks gently as the beams adjust to the night air. A breeze pushes through the open eaves, and a moth flutters briefly across your face before disappearing toward the forge. The scent of ash and old lacquer lingers, comforting in its persistence, and your eyes begin to close, not out of surrender, but out of trust. In the half-sleep that follows, your dreams begin. Not with a bang or a story, but with a slow unfolding, like a scroll unrolling itself without words, just images, fuzzy at first, but growing clearer as you drift deeper. You see a field, broad and golden, the sky split with streaks of cloud like pulled silk, and in the center of it stands a lone warrior in full armor, back turned toward you, motionless. You know instinctively that the armor is yours. The lacquer reflects a dull glow, not sunlight, but something softer, perhaps moonlight, or something even more ancient. And the cords sway slightly in a wind you cannot feel. The warrior moves slowly, turns, and the face is blank, featureless. A mask you do not recognize, and yet you feel no fear, only curiosity. The figure raises one arm, not to threaten, not to salute, but simply to acknowledge. And in that gesture, something unspoken passes between you, as if to say, "You built this, and I wore it." And that is enough. You wake not with a start, but with a sigh, the kind that stretches through your ribs and lingers in your chest long after your eyes open. The room is unchanged. The tools sleep where you left them. The armor racks stand half-filled, waiting. Your cup is still on the step, now fully empty, and the kettle has cooled. You sit up slowly, the woven mat beneath your back, imprinted with the shape of your body. And for a moment, you remain still, not out of reluctance, but to savor the thin line between dream and day, between what was imagined and what remains real. A bird calls in the distance, sharp, single, annoyed. You hear the neighbor's shutter slide open, and somewhere nearby, a rooster begins its overconfident announcement of morning. Far earlier than necessary, you rise, stretch, and gather your tools without ceremony. There is no fanfare here, no audience to applaud, the beginning of another day, spent threading, sewing, adjusting, polishing. But the forge, like you, is patient. It waits. It accepts your return without question. And as the charcoal begins to crackle again, sending up its first lazy ribbons of smoke into the waking air, you can almost hear the armor humming, not loudly, not proudly, but gently, like a lullaby played in reverse. Because this is your craft, and whether or not it ever blocks a real blow, whether or not it ever walks onto a battlefield, or becomes part of some dramatic tale historians will puzzle over centuries from now, it was built by your hands, shaped by your breath, touched by your dreams, and that in this slow, quiet life is more than enough. The sun has long since set, though you wouldn't have noticed the moment it slipped behind the ridge, because the workshop's interior glows with a soft, smoky haze from the ember bed that never quite dies, its coals red and pulsing like the sleepy heartbeat of the forge itself. And as you sit in the same low stool you've used for nearly 20 years, its legs now uneven from the steady pressure of your right heel, you slowly coil the last length of braided silk back into its wooden spindle. The day's final task, neither urgent nor important, but necessary in the same way. Brushing dust from a shrine feels more about reverence than utility. Tonight, the forge hums differently. Not louder, not hotter, just lower, slower, like it's breathing along with you. And you find that comforting. The way its glow fills the workshop's corners with shadows that look less like darkness and more like rest. As though even the hammers have begun to doze, their heavy iron heads slightly tilted on the rack, their handles glistening faintly from the oil you rubbed in weeks ago. A kindness they never asked for, but which you give anyway. Because tools, like people, wear out more gently when tended to with care. You are alone now, not dramatically, not sorrowfully, just in the normal way that evening descends upon people who work with their hands and forget to count the hours. And as your fingers move without urgency, looping cord over cord and tucking the frayed ends beneath the spool's lip, you become vaguely aware of the crickets outside, tuning their little legs like fiddlers in a 1,000-pocketed orchestra. None in key, none in time, and yet somehow perfect in their disorganization. Their presence, a signal that night, has arrived fully and without apology. There is something oddly tender about this part of the evening. The hum of the forge reduced to a whisper, the lacquer jars sealed, the cloths folded and set neatly atop one another. Not because anyone will inspect your neatness, but because disorder now, at the very end, would feel like a betrayal of the stillness you've worked all day to earn. You sip from a cup of barley tea that's more warm than hot, the last of the day's leaves settling at the bottom in lazy spirals, and as you swallow, you taste not just the drink, but the repetition of days. The hundreds, maybe thousands, of similar sips, each one marking the end of labor, the pause before dreams. You don't plan to start anything new tonight. No additional threading, no last-minute repairs, no ambitious polishing or overly hopeful attempts at resizing that mismatched coty pair that's been sitting on the corner bench since spring. Instead, you lean back slightly, allowing the wooden wall behind you to take the weight of your shoulders. And you look, not at anything in particular, but at everything at once. The gentle lean of the armor stands, their lacquered surfaces reflecting the forge light like calm water. The way the tatami mat edges curl slightly at the corners. The tiny specks of dust caught mid-air, made visible only because the fire insists on revealing them. It is in these quiet, slow-burning minutes that you feel most connected. Not to customers or deadlines or even to the armor itself, but to something wider, older, as though each breath you take joins you, however faintly, to the chain of armor makers before you. Men and women whose names you'll never know, but whose calloused thumbs and patient eyes must have mirrored yours, bent over iron and silk long before your grandfather's anvil ever found its place in this shop. Historians still argue whether individual craftsmen of the Edo period had creative autonomy in their work, or were merely replicators, bound by the rigid expectations of daimyo patrons and guild constraints. But sitting here now, with the workshop silent, except for the forger's murmur and the soft scratch of your sleeve against your arm, you suspect the truth lies, as always, somewhere in the middle. You've certainly copied the same forms over and over. Standard shoulder flares, regulation helm angles, crests that follow family lineage charts more strictly than temple registers. But within those repetitions, there's always been room for a flourish. A curve made smoother than necessary. A cord tied in a knot just slightly more elegant than required. A lining sewn with extra care, not for any reward, but because the act of doing it right feels better than the act of simply finishing it. And now, with the workbench cleared and the day quietly tucking itself into memory, you rise, slowly, carefully, like lifting yourself out of a pond you've been sitting in for hours. Your joints stiff, but not painful. Your thoughts gently floating behind you. And you extinguish the last exposed ember, not by dousing, but by softly covering it with ash. The way your grandfather taught you, claiming that a fire treated kindly at the end is more willing to be reborn the next morning. You move toward the back door, not to leave, but to open it slightly. Let in the deeper night, the one that comes after the neighbors have fallen asleep and the dogs have given up on barking at ghosts. The moon hangs low, half hidden behind the cedar branches, its light soft enough to forgive the scratches on the door frame and the uneven stones of the garden path. You listen, not for anything specific, but just in case the world decides to say something. It doesn't, not tonight, but that's fine. You step outside barefoot, the earth still holding a hint of the day's heat. And you walk the short path to the edge of the pond, where frogs have already begun their gurgled lullabies, and the water holds still like glass, reflecting back the vague shape of your face. Tired, yes, but calm in that slow, satisfied way that only comes after a full day of doing something repetitive and strangely holy. You crouch, splash your face, not to wake up, but to honor the moment, to cool your skin, and mark the boundary between working and resting. You stay there for a few breaths longer, watching a lone firefly blink near the stones, its light the color of warm iron cooling after the hammering's done. You rise again, return to the workshop, dim what few lanterns remain lit, and ease the door shut behind you. The forge doesn't protest. It simply waits as you lie down on the folded futon once more, your arms relaxed at your sides, your fingers finally still. You feel the last threads of awareness begin to unspool. Not quickly, not all at once, but gently, like silk unraveling from a bobbin. Your breathing deepens, the ceiling fades, and somewhere in the darkness, you imagine the armor you've made rising to its feet, one piece at a time. Cuirass to backplate, helm to throat, sleeves unfurling, cords tightening with invisible hands, until it stands tall and empty, not threatening, not triumphant, but simply waiting. Waiting for the next lazy afternoon, waiting for the next quiet hand, waiting for you. And now, as the last glimmer of the forge has fully gone out, as even the crickets outside have slowed their rhythm to something more like a sigh than a song, You feel the weight of the day finally dissolve. Not all at once, but slowly, gently, like steam lifting from a bowl of miso left untouched on a quiet windowsill. Its warmth no longer urgent, its presence enough. The night wraps around you like an old kimono, thin in places, but familiar, and stitched with memories in its folds. Your hands, still faintly tingling from the repetition of the day's motions, begin to relax completely, each finger softening as though they too are ready to sleep. There is no need to dream of distant battles or glorious deeds, no visions of armored warriors charging across misty fields, no echoing drums, only the faint clink of tools settling into silence, and the memory of silk cords slipping between your fingers like slow-moving water. Outside, the garden stones cool under the breath of the night wind. The moon has risen higher now, and the frogs, bless their persistence, have begun their second act. Slower, deeper, more spaced out. You listen to them the way a child listens to bedtime stories they've already heard 100 times. Without questions, without expectation. Letting the rhythm lull you into a place where meaning isn't necessary. Only presence. Somewhere nearby, a bamboo water spout tips, spills, resets. A sound so soft it barely seems real. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's memory. Or maybe the whole day was. The cat that never moved. The thread that frayed. The ghost of a splinter still imagined in your thumb. Whatever it was, whatever today meant, you don't have to understand it. Not now. You are safe. You are still. You are done.